Welcome to Haunted Voice channel for a rainy night. Before we get started, just a quick reminder, there are minimal ads in this video. If you enjoy the content, please hit the like button and subscribe. It really helps me create more stories for you. Also, I'd love to know where you're from and what time you're watching. I hope you enjoy the stories, and thank you so much for tuning in. Now let's get started. I've always been the kind of guy who likes a challenge, which is probably why I agreed to this insane camping trip in the first place. Miles off the grid, no trail markers, no campsites, nothing but the wild and us. It was supposed to be an adventure, the kind of weekend where you come back with stories that make everyone at the office jealous. There were 4 of us, me, Jake, our mutual friend Nate, and this guy I didn't know too well, David. He was a last-minute addition, brought in by Nate. David was one of those quiet, intense types. Didn't say much, but had this way of watching everyone like he was sizing us up. I didn't think too much of it at the time. I probably should have. The drive was long, and the trailhead we finally stopped at wasn't even on a map. Jake had heard about it from some guy at work who swore it was a hidden gem, a place no one ever went, untouched by the crowds that overran most camping spots. Looking back, I wonder why it was so hidden in the first place. We hiked deep into the forest, the trees growing thicker, their canopy so dense that barely any sunlight filtered through. The deeper we went, the quieter everything became. It was that kind of unnatural quiet where even the birds stopped singing. The only sound was the crunch of our boots and the rustling of our gear. By late afternoon, we reached a clearing, and I was relieved to see we could at least set up camp without getting lost in the maze of trees. But something about that clearing felt off. It was circular, too perfect, like the forest had peeled itself back from that one spot for a reason. I brushed the thought aside. Maybe I was just tired. We got the tents up, started a fire, and everything seemed normal enough. We joked around, had a few beers, and settled in as night fell. But there was something odd about David. He barely spoke the whole time, just sat staring into the fire with this unsettling intensity. His face flickered in the firelight, his expression unreadable. Around midnight, Jake stood up, stretching. "I'm going to grab more wood," he said, slapping Nate on the shoulder. "Want to help?" Nate groaned but followed him, and the 2 of them disappeared into the trees, their headlamps bobbing like distant stars. I stayed by the fire with David. The quiet between us grew thick, uncomfortable. The only sound was the crackle of the fire and the distant wind whispering through the trees. That's when I noticed something strange. David wasn't watching the fire anymore. He was staring out into the dark woods, unblinking, like he was waiting for something. His face was tense, jaw clenched tight, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. "You okay, man?" I asked, trying to sound casual, but my voice wavered. He didn't answer, just kept staring, eyes locked on the shadows between the trees. The rustling of leaves snapped my attention toward the direction Jake and Nate had gone. I assumed it was them coming back, but the sound was wrong. It was too fast, too erratic, like something crashing through the underbrush. I stood up, straining my ears, but I couldn't see anything beyond the circle of light cast by the fire. "Jake?" I called out, my voice echoing in the stillness. No answer. That's when I saw it. A figure, moving between the trees, just at the edge of the clearing. It was barely visible, almost like a shadow against the night. But there was something off about its movement. It didn't walk. It glided, smooth and unnatural, like it wasn't part of the world. "Jake, is that you?" I yelled, but the figure didn't respond. It just stopped, standing there at the very edge of the light, just far enough that I couldn't make out its face. I turned to David, but he was still staring into the darkness, his body rigid. I grabbed my flashlight and swung it toward the figure, but it was gone. Just trees and empty space. My heart was pounding now. "Where the hell is Jake?" I muttered, more to myself than anyone. David finally spoke, his voice low and unnerving. "They won't come back." "What?" "They won't come back," he repeated, his eyes still fixed on the woods. "They never do." I stared at him, my stomach twisting with unease. "What the hell are you talking about?" David finally turned to me, and in the glow of the fire, I saw something in his face that sent a chill down my spine. It wasn't fear. It was acceptance. "You shouldn't have come here," he said quietly. I laughed, but it was hollow. "Come on, man. Quit messing around." He shook his head. "It's not a joke. This place, it's not like anywhere else. I've been here before." That stopped me cold. "What do you mean? You've been here?" David nodded, his eyes dark and distant. "Years ago, I lost 2 friends here. Same way. They went into the woods, and they never came back." I felt a knot of panic tighten in my chest. "You've got to be kidding me." "I tried to warn Nate," he continued, ignoring me. "Told him we shouldn't come here, but he wouldn't listen." The rustling sound returned, louder now, closer. I swung my flashlight around, desperately scanning the trees. But there was nothing, just the empty forest. My pulse was racing. Something wasn't right. My gut screamed at me to run, but I couldn't leave without Jake and Nate. Suddenly, David stood up. "It's starting," he muttered, more to himself than to me. I grabbed his arm. "What's starting?" He yanked his arm free and stepped toward the edge of the clearing, his eyes fixed on something I couldn't see. "They always come back, at first, but they're not the same." Before I could ask what the hell he meant, a sound came from the woods. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, crunching through the fallen leaves. Relief surged through me. Jake and Nate were back. "Guys?" I called out, but my voice was shaky. Then I saw them. Jake and Nate stepped into the clearing, but something was wrong. Their movements were stiff, unnatural, like their bodies were being pulled forward by invisible strings. Their faces were pale, eyes wide and vacant. Dead eyes. "Jake? Nate?" I whispered, but they didn't respond. David didn't move, just stood there watching as they walked. No, glided, closer. My blood turned to ice. This wasn't right. Something was horribly, terribly wrong. "They're not real anymore," David said softly. "They look like them, but they're not. Not anymore." I took a step back, my mind reeling, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Jake and Nate, whatever they were, stopped just a few feet from the fire, their faces blank, empty. David turned to me, his expression grim. "This place, it takes them, leaves copies, but they're hollow. They'll try to lure us into the woods next." I backed away, fear clawing at my throat. "We have to get out of here." David nodded, but there was no hope in his eyes. "It's too late." As he spoke, the figures that used to be Jake and Nate took a step closer. Their eyes locked on me now, their mouths slowly curling into unnatural, empty smiles. And then they spoke. "Come with us." Their voices were wrong, distorted, too high, like they were mimicking the real Jake and Nate, but didn't know how to get the tone right. My skin crawled. "We have to run," I whispered, but David didn't move. He just smiled, a sad, resigned smile. "You can't run from the forest." I turned and bolted, not caring if David followed. As I crashed through the trees, that same eerie voice echoed behind me, chasing me deeper into the night. "Come with us. I'm still running. I don't know if I'll ever stop." It was supposed to be the perfect weekend, just me and my girlfriend Hannah out in the woods, away from everything. We needed this trip, something to clear our heads, to get us back on track. Lately, life had been weighing us down, the stress, the arguments, the distance creeping in like a slow poison. This was meant to fix that. We picked a spot far from any other campsites, isolated on the edge of a dense, sprawling forest. It was the kind of place where the world felt untouched, ancient. You could feel the weight of the years in the air, thick and still, almost like time itself had forgotten this place. It was perfect. The first day was uneventful. We set up the tent, gathered firewood, and cooked dinner as the sun dipped low, casting the woods in a warm, orange glow. For the first time in weeks, we laughed. It felt good, normal. I started to believe this trip might actually fix things between us. That night, though, things started to get strange. It was around midnight when I woke up, the fire outside just embers, casting flickering shadows against the tent. Hannah was still asleep beside me, her breathing soft and steady. But something had stirred me, some sound just beyond the thin walls of the tent, a low rustling, like something moving through the underbrush. I strained to listen, my heart beating faster. At first, I thought it might just be a deer, or maybe the wind moving the leaves. But the sound was too deliberate, too human. I sat up, careful not to wake Hannah, and unzipped the tent just enough to peek outside. The forest was dark, the moon barely lighting the tops of the trees. At first I didn't see anything, just the silhouettes of the trees and the faint glow of the dying fire. But then, from the corner of my eye, I caught movement. A shape, low to the ground, moving slowly through the bushes at the edge of the clearing. It was too dark to make out details, but the way it moved, it wasn't right. It didn't walk, it slithered. I felt a shiver crawl up my spine as I stared at the spot where I had seen it, but whatever it was had disappeared, melting into the blackness of the trees. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was probably just an animal. I zipped the tent back up and laid down, pulling Hannah closer. But sleep didn't come easy after that. The next morning I mentioned it to Hannah, but she just shrugged it off. "It's the woods, babe. There are animals everywhere." She was probably right. I tried to convince myself that I was just being paranoid, but that unease lingered in the back of my mind all day. We spent the day hiking deeper into the forest. The trees here were massive, their branches intertwining like skeletal hands reaching out to block the sun. There was something oppressive about the woods the further in we went, the kind of silence that pressed in on you from all sides, like the world was holding its breath. The strangest part, though, was how we never saw anyone else. Not a single hiker, not even a distant trail. This place was completely empty, like we were the only ones left in the world. By the time we got back to camp, the sun was setting again, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch and warp the landscape. The fire crackled to life as I lit it, and for a moment, things felt normal again. We cooked dinner, drank some wine, and sat by the fire, talking and laughing like nothing had happened the night before. But when the fire started to die down, that feeling returned, that oppressive silence, that sense of being watched. I kept glancing into the trees, expecting to see movement, to see that shape from the night before. But there was nothing, just the dark, endless forest. We decided to turn in for the night, and I tried to push the unease to the back of my mind. But as soon as we crawled into the tent, I knew something was wrong. The air inside felt wrong. It smelled faintly of earth, damp and decaying. At first I thought it was just the forest, but it was too strong, too close. I turned to Hannah, but she had already drifted off, her back to me. I wanted to wake her, to tell her that something felt off, but I didn't. I didn't want to seem paranoid, to ruin the trip we so desperately needed. Then I heard it again, the rustling. But this time, it wasn't outside. It was inside the tent. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The sound was faint, like something shifting beneath the fabric of the tent floor. I reached out slowly, my hand trembling as I pressed it against the floor. I could feel something moving underneath, a slow, subtle writhing like something alive was buried just beneath us. My heart pounded in my chest as I pulled my hand back, trying not to make a sound. I turned to shake Hannah awake, but when I touched her shoulder, she didn't stir. "Hannah?" I whispered, my voice shaking. No response. I shook her again, harder this time. "Hannah!" She rolled over, her eyes closed, her face pale and slack. My stomach dropped. Her skin was ice cold. I scrambled out of the sleeping bag, grabbing the flashlight. I shined it on her, my hands trembling, my mind racing. She was breathing, but barely. Her skin was covered in a thin layer of dirt, like she'd been lying in the ground. I couldn't understand what I was seeing. I shook her again, harder. "Hannah, wake up." Her eyes fluttered open, but they weren't. Right. They were dull, lifeless, like she wasn't really seeing me. Then, slowly, her mouth opened. "Get out," she whispered, her voice flat, mechanical. I stumbled back, my heart racing, my mind spinning. What are you—" "Get out," she repeated, her voice more urgent now, her eyes locking onto mine. But they weren't Hannah's eyes anymore. Something else was looking at me through them, something ancient and cold. Before I could move, she sat up, her movement stiff, unnatural. The dirt on her skin began to crack and fall away, revealing something dark and slick underneath, something that wasn't human. I scrambled backward, my foot catching on the edge of the tent, and I fell hard against the ground outside. As I lay there gasping for breath, I saw her crawl out of the tent, her limbs contorting, twisting into unnatural angles. That's when I realized this wasn't Hannah anymore. It never had been. Not since last night. The thing wearing her skin tilted its head, staring at me with those hollow eyes, its mouth twisting into a grotesque smile, and then it spoke in a voice that was no longer hers. "She's with us now. You should have left." I didn't stay to hear anything else. I ran, deeper into the forest, the thing's laughter echoing behind me. And now as I sit here writing this, I can still hear it in the distance. It's coming for me. I don't think I'll make it out of these woods. But if you ever find this, don't go looking for her. Don't go looking for me. I've always been the kind of person who enjoyed my own company. Alone, I could think clearly, away from the constant hum of city life. So, when I decided to take a solo camping trip deep into the national forest, it didn't feel reckless or strange. It felt like a reset. Just me, the trees, and the open sky. The location was remote, about a 5-hour drive into the heart of the forest, followed by a 2-hour hike off the main trail. I'd chosen a spot far from any popular campsites, an area that few hikers ventured to. The idea of being miles away from anyone else was exactly what I needed. The hike in was uneventful, peaceful even. The towering pines seemed to whisper in the breeze, and the path was well worn enough to follow without much difficulty. By the time I reached my campsite, the sun was just beginning to set, casting a warm golden glow through the trees. I set up my tent in a small clearing, made a modest fire, and settled in for a quiet night. As the fire crackled and the light began to fade, the forest around me came alive with the sounds of night. Crickets chirped, and the occasional hoot of an owl echoed through the trees. It was comforting, in a way, being surrounded by nature's rhythm, but as the darkness deepened, the forest seemed to change. The sounds became less distinct, more distant, and an eerie quiet began to settle over the campsite. I brushed it off as my imagination. It was just the isolation playing tricks on me, making me more aware of the silence. I sat by the fire, poking at the embers when I heard it, something faint, almost like a whisper carried on the wind. I paused, listening carefully. Nothing. Just the fire and the gentle rustling of leaves in the breeze. Then it came again. A whisper, so faint I couldn't make out the words. It seemed to come from just beyond the reach of the firelight, somewhere in the trees. My heart skipped a beat, and I scanned the forest with my flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness but revealing nothing. I told myself it was the wind, or maybe some animal far off in the woods. I wasn't used to being this far out, alone, with nothing but the trees for company. My mind was probably just playing tricks on me. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't as alone as I thought. I stoked the fire, trying to push the unease from my mind. Hours passed, and the whispering stopped, but I kept glancing into the dark woods, my nerves on edge. The fire crackled and popped, sending sparks into the air, and for a moment everything felt calm again. Then, out of nowhere, I heard it, a soft snap like a branch breaking underfoot. This time, it was close, too close. I froze, every muscle in my body tensing. The sound had come from the trees, just a few yards beyond my camp. I grabbed my flashlight and stood up, slowly turning toward the source of the noise. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaky in the quiet. No answer, just the oppressive silence and the low hum of the fire behind me. I shined the light into the woods, scanning the trees, but there was nothing, no movement, no sign of anyone or anything. But the feeling of being watched was overwhelming, pressing down on me like a weight. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, straining to hear something, anything. But the forest had gone completely still. No crickets, no wind, just silence. Slowly, I backed away toward the fire, my eyes never leaving the tree line. I knew it had to be an animal, something small, maybe a deer or a raccoon. But the footsteps, they had sounded too deliberate, too slow, as if whatever was out there was aware of me, watching my every move. I sat down, keeping my flashlight close, and tried to calm my racing thoughts. The fire was burning low now, and the shadows around me grew longer, darker, twisting in the flickering light. That's when I heard it again, the whisper. But this time it was different, closer, clearer. My name. Someone or something had whispered my name. My blood ran cold. I stood up so fast I nearly knocked over the fire pit. My heart hammered in my chest, and I shined the flashlight wildly into the trees, searching for any sign of movement. Nothing. The whisper came again, my name drawn out in a slow, almost sing-song voice, as if it were coming from every direction at once. I spun around, pointing the light into the woods, but no matter where I looked, the trees seemed empty. I was alone. But how did it know my name? My pulse raced as I backed toward my tent, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold the flashlight. Every instinct told me to run, to get out of there, but something kept me rooted to the spot. The whispering continued, soft and rhythmic, calling my name over and over again. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end, my body trembling with fear. Then, just beyond the reach of the firelight, I saw something move. A figure. It was faint, barely more than a shadow, but it was there, standing just inside the tree line, tall and unnaturally still. My flashlight flickered as I pointed it toward the figure, but the light seemed to bend around it, like it couldn't touch whatever was standing there. I couldn't make out any details, just a dark shape, human-like, but wrong. Too tall, too thin, its outline shimmering like a heat mirage, and those eyes, two pale orbs reflecting the faintest glint of light. I stumbled backward, my mind reeling. The whispering grew louder, more insistent, and I realized with a sickening dread that it wasn't coming from the figure. It was coming from behind me. I spun around, but there was nothing, just empty air and the dying fire. But the whispering was everywhere, filling the air, growing louder, closer. I grabbed my bag, my legs shaking so badly I could barely move, and bolted. I didn't even bother to pack up the tent. I just ran, flashlight in hand, my breath coming in ragged gasps as I tore through the forest, back toward the trail. The whispering followed me. I could hear it in my ears, in my head, growing louder with every step. The figure, whatever it was, stayed just at the edge of my vision, never fully visible, but always there, watching, waiting. I didn't stop running until I reached the car. I slammed the door shut and fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking uncontrollably. As the engine roared to life, I sped down the dirt road, not daring to look back. Even now, as I sit here safe in my apartment, I can still hear it. The faint whisper of my name, carried on a breeze that shouldn't exist, drifting through the cracks in the walls. I know I wasn't alone out there, and whatever it was, it knows my name. It started out as the perfect trip. Just me and my two friends, Mike and Sarah, camping deep in the remote wilderness, far from the noise and bustle of city life. We'd been planning this weekend getaway for months, eager to disconnect and unwind under the stars. We found the perfect spot, a small clearing surrounded by towering pines right next to a crystal-clear lake. No other campers for miles. It was exactly what we were looking for. The first day went off without a hitch. We set up our tents, gathered wood for the fire, and spent the evening swapping stories as the sun dipped behind the mountains. The night was calm, the sky bursting with stars, and the only sound was the soft lapping of the lake against the shore. For a moment, it felt like we were the only people on Earth. But as the fire burned down to embers and we started to drift off to sleep, I heard it. A voice. It was distant, almost like a whisper carried on the wind, but unmistakable. A single word that sent a shiver down my spine. Help. I sat up in my sleeping bag, listening intently. At first, I thought it was Mike or Sarah playing a prank, but when I looked over, both were fast asleep in their tents. The fire crackled softly, casting weak light over the campsite, but everything else was silent. The trees stood still, the lake was calm, and there was no wind. I convinced myself I must have been hearing things, maybe a distant echo of the forest or some animal call that my mind misinterpreted. I forced myself to lay back down, closing my eyes, though sleep didn't come easily. The next day I didn't mention it to Mike or Sarah. No point in freaking them out, right? We spent the day hiking, exploring the woods, and even went for a swim in the lake. The strange moment from the night before faded into the background, replaced by laughter and the thrill of being disconnected from everything. But that night, the voice came back. It started just as I was dozing off. That same soft, eerie whisper, barely audible but impossible to ignore. This time it was clearer, closer. Help! Me! I shot up, my heart racing. I wasn't imagining it this time. I unzipped my tent and stepped outside. The campfire had died out completely, leaving only faint embers glowing in the dark. Mike and Sarah were still asleep. Everything around me was still and quiet. I grabbed my flashlight and pointed it toward the tree line, half expecting to see someone standing there. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the towering pines and casting long, twisted shadows across the ground, but there was nothing. No movement, no signs of life. Then the voice came again. Help. Me. Please. It was coming from the lake. I turned slowly, shining the flashlight toward the water. The lake was perfectly still, its surface like glass, reflecting the stars above. But in the distance, right near the center of the lake, I saw something, just barely, a dark figure standing in the water. My heart skipped a beat. It looked like a person, just standing there, half submerged, motionless. Mike, Sarah, I shouted, backing away from the lake, my voice shaking. They scrambled out of their tents, groggy and confused. What is it? Mike asked, rubbing his eyes. I pointed toward the lake, my hand trembling. There's someone out there. They both turned and looked. Sarah grabbed her flashlight and aimed it toward the water, but by the time the beam hit the lake, the figure was gone. The water was still again, as if nothing had ever been there. Are you sure? Sarah asked, her voice skeptical but uneasy. I saw something, I muttered, unsure of my own words now. And I heard someone asking for help. Mike shook his head. We're in the middle of nowhere, man. There's no one out here but us. I know what I heard, I insisted, but the doubt in my voice was obvious. We stayed up for another hour, circling the camp with our flashlights, but there was nothing. No tracks, no signs of anyone near the lake. Eventually, we gave up, figuring it must have been my mind playing tricks on me, a trick of the light. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The third night was when everything fell apart. I woke up in the middle of the night to a sound I'll never forget, the distinct, slow, dragging sound of something being pulled across the ground. It was close, way too close to our camp. I froze, every muscle tensing as I strained to listen. The dragging stopped, followed by the unmistakable sound of breathing, slow, raspy breaths, right outside my tent. I held my breath, terrified that whatever it was would hear me. Then the voice, "Help me!" But this time it wasn't a distant whisper. It was right outside my tent, low and guttural, as if someone, or something, was crouched just on the other side of the fabric, begging to be let in. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed the zipper of my tent and yanked it open, ready to confront whatever nightmare was haunting me. But there was no one there, just darkness and silence. "Mike! Sarah!" I shouted again, scrambling out of my tent. They burst out of their tents, panicked and confused. "What's going on?" Mike asked, flashlight in hand. I tried to explain, but the words got caught in my throat. That's when we all heard it. The voice, clear as day this time, coming from the trees. "Help me." We all turned at once, shining our flashlights toward the source of the sound. There, standing just at the edge of the forest, was a figure. A woman, her clothes tattered and soaked, her face pale, almost glowing in the dark. Her eyes were wide, hollow, and locked onto ours. "Help me," she whispered again, her voice so broken it barely sounded human. We stood frozen, too terrified to move as she stepped forward. Her feet didn't touch the ground. She hovered just above the earth, moving toward us slowly, her arms outstretched. That was it. We bolted. We grabbed whatever we could and ran, leaving the camp, our gear, everything behind. I didn't look back until we reached the trailhead, and even then I couldn't shake the feeling that she was still following us, her hollow eyes watching, waiting. We made it back to civilization by morning, exhausted and shaken. None of us spoke about what we saw, but we didn't need to. We all knew what we had heard, what we had seen. I don't go camping anymore. I can't, because sometimes, when the night is quiet and the world is still, I can still hear that voice, faint but clear, calling from deep in the woods. "Help me." For as long as I can remember, camping was my thing. The solitude, the crackling fire, the escape from everyday life. I couldn't get enough. This trip, though, was going to be special. I had found a campsite that few people knew about, deep in the heart of an untouched forest. No trails, no signs of civilization, just raw wilderness. Exactly what I wanted. I had heard about the place from a friend who swore it was the most peaceful, remote spot he'd ever found. But he'd warned me, "Don't go too deep into the valley. Weird stuff happens there." Of course, I didn't take him seriously. Weird stuff, to me, usually meant bears rummaging through your food or strange noises in the night. Things that any seasoned camper could handle. So, naturally, I made it my mission to camp as deep in that valley as I could. I arrived mid-afternoon after hours of hiking through dense forest. The air was thick, almost humid, and there was an eerie quietness that hung over the place. No birds, no wind, just stillness. I found a clearing near a large rock formation that jutted out from the ground like jagged teeth. It looked perfect for the night, sheltered, flat, and with a stunning view of the valley below. After setting up my tent and starting a fire, I settled in, eager to enjoy the peace and quiet. But that strange feeling, the heavy silence, lingered. It wasn't like the normal quiet of the woods. It was oppressive, as if the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting. I tried to ignore it. I told myself I was overthinking it and focused on cooking dinner over the fire. But just as I was about to take my first bite, I heard something, a deep, distant thump. I paused, staring into the woods, trying to pinpoint the sound. It wasn't a falling branch or an animal moving through the brush. It was much lower, almost like a dull vibration coming from the ground. Thump. There it was again, louder this time, like it was coming closer. I put down my food and stood up, scanning the tree line. Nothing moved, no sound, just that same oppressive stillness. Then, after a long pause, thump, thump. It was rhythmic now, like something enormous was moving deep beneath the surface of the earth. I crouched down, placing my hand on the ground to feel for vibrations, but I couldn't sense anything physical, only the sound growing louder, deeper, as if the ground itself was groaning. I shook my head. "It's just my imagination," I whispered to myself. Maybe the echoes of a far-off landslide or underground water shifting. I forced myself to sit back down, but the sound didn't stop. Thump, thump, thump. It was steady now, closer than ever, coming from directly beneath me. I stood up again, trying to make sense of what I was hearing. The ground didn't feel like it was shaking, but the noise was unmistakable, coming from somewhere deep below. Then, as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. I stayed frozen, waiting for the sound to return, but the night was silent once more. A heavy, crushing silence. By now, my nerves were on edge. It didn't feel right. The forest seemed too still, too watchful. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was underneath me, something waiting just beneath the earth. I debated packing up and leaving right then, but the hike back to my car would take hours, and it was already getting dark. Reluctantly, I decided to stay. Maybe it had just been a strange acoustic phenomenon. Maybe the sound wouldn't come back, but of course it did. That night, as I lay in my tent, the rhythmic thump returned. Louder now, closer. My heart raced as the sound reverberated through the stillness, the deep, resonant beat vibrating in my ears, but never in the ground. It was as if something was trying to claw its way up from beneath me. I sat up, clutching my flashlight, but something stopped me from unzipping the tent. There was no way I was going outside. Instead, I sat in the dark, listening, waiting. Then, the noise changed. The thump was still there, but now it was accompanied by a new sound, a strange, dragging noise, like something massive and slow was pulling itself through the dirt, scraping against the rocks, inching its way up toward the surface. It was coming closer. I knew it. The noise grew louder and more erratic, like whatever was beneath me was struggling, pushing harder, faster. I couldn't take it anymore. My instincts screamed at me to move, to run, but the rational part of my brain kept whispering, "It's not real, there's no such thing." But I couldn't believe that anymore. I grabbed my backpack and burst out of the tent, my flashlight casting wild beams of light through the trees. The sound stopped for a moment, and I froze, heart pounding in my throat. The dragging and thumping were gone, just the silence again. But then, from behind the massive rock formation, I heard a new sound. A low, guttural moan, deep and primal, unlike anything I'd ever heard before. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't human. It was something else. I backed away slowly, shining the flashlight toward the rock. The beam caught something, just for a second. A flash of movement, something pale and long like a limb, sliding back behind the stone. I didn't stick around to get a better look. I turned and ran. I didn't stop to pack up the tent. I didn't stop to gather my gear. I just ran, crashing through the woods, stumbling over roots and rocks, not caring about the noise I made. My only goal was to get as far away from that place as possible. The whole way back, I felt like I was being followed. I could hear it, the faintest trace of that dragging, scraping sound, like it was still crawling its way through the dirt, inching closer. Even though I couldn't see anything when I looked back, I could feel it. I didn't stop running until I reached my car. I jumped in, slammed the door, and sped off without looking back. I've told this story to a few friends, but they never believe me. They say it was just an overactive imagination, a trick of the mind after too many hours alone in the woods. But I know what I heard, I know what I saw, and I haven't been camping since. There's something in that valley, something that shouldn't be disturbed, something waiting. I've camped in a lot of places over the years. Some were breathtaking, others challenging. but none ever left me feeling as unsettled as my trip to Black Hollow Ridge. It's a stretch of forest tucked away in the mountains, not far from a place called Fogwood Creek. The area gets its name from the thick, low-hanging fog that rolls in almost every evening. Locals warned me not to go too deep into the woods. They said the fog plays tricks on you, that once it settles in, it's easy to lose your way. Some even claimed that people had disappeared there, but I didn't think much of it. I figured they were just trying to keep people from disturbing their little patch of untouched wilderness. That's exactly why I went. I craved the isolation, the challenge. I wanted to be alone, to disconnect from everything for a while. So I packed up my gear and set off, excited to spend a few days in what I thought was just another remote part of the country. I arrived at the trailhead early in the morning, greeted by the cool, damp air that the ridge was known for. The fog was already starting to settle, swirling in delicate patterns around the trees, but visibility was still decent. I followed the trail for a couple of miles before veering off into the forest, determined to find a spot deep enough to be completely alone. By midday I had found the perfect place, a small clearing bordered by tall, ancient trees. The ground was soft with moss, and there was a small stream nearby for water. I set up my tent, built a small fire, and settled in. The silence was comforting at first, the kind of quiet that only comes when you're miles away from another human being. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, the fog thickened. It crept in slowly at first, a few wisps twisting through the trees, but soon it was everywhere, an endless sea of gray. I could barely see 10 feet in front of me, the dense mist swallowing up everything beyond the glow of the fire. That's when the strange thing started. At first it was just a feeling, that prickling sensation at the back of your neck when you know you're being watched. I brushed it off, figuring it was just the eerie atmosphere playing tricks on me. But the longer I sat by the fire, the stronger the sensation grew. It felt like something, or someone, was standing just beyond the fog, watching me, waiting. I tried to ignore it, but it was impossible to shake the sense of being observed. I stood up, grabbed my flashlight, and swept it through the mist. The beam barely penetrated the fog, illuminating only a small patch of forest before being swallowed up by the gray. Nothing. No movement, no signs of life. Still, the feeling wouldn't go away. I sat back down, trying to focus on the crackling of the fire, the rhythmic sound of the stream, anything to distract myself. But then I heard it. A faint rustling, soft, like something moving through the underbrush. I grabbed the flashlight again, scanning the trees. The noise stopped as soon as I shone the light, but as soon as I turned it off, it started again, closer this time. I stood up, heart pounding in my chest, straining to hear over the sound of the wind moving through the fog. For a moment, everything went quiet, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. Then, out of nowhere, came a whisper, low, barely more than a breath, but unmistakable. "Come closer." My blood ran cold. The voice was soft, distant, but clear enough that I couldn't have imagined it. I spun around, shining my flashlight in every direction, but there was nothing. Just that thick, impenetrable fog pressing in on me from all sides. I called out, my voice shaky, "Who's there?" No response. I told myself it was just the wind. The fog can do strange things to sound, make it seem like it's coming from somewhere else. But deep down I knew it wasn't the wind. There was something out there, something I couldn't see, hiding just beyond the firelight. I tried to calm myself, taking slow, deep breaths, telling myself I was just being paranoid. But then I heard it again, this time closer. "Come closer." The voice was unmistakable now, soft and coaxing, like someone standing just behind me. I whipped around, the flashlight shaking in my hand, but the fog was so thick that I couldn't see more than a few feet ahead. My pulse raced, the air around me thick with tension. I backed up slowly toward the fire, my eyes darting between the trees, trying to catch a glimpse of anything, any sign of movement, any shadow. But there was nothing. Then from the fog, I saw something, a figure, barely visible through the dense mist, but there, standing just beyond the edge of the clearing. It was tall, unnaturally so, its silhouette distorted by the fog. I couldn't make out any features, but I could feel its gaze, cold and unwavering, locked onto me. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound. It just stood there watching. "Come closer." The whisper was louder now, like it was coming from the figure itself, though I couldn't see a mouth or eyes or anything human about it. My instincts screamed at me to run, but my legs wouldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, staring at the shadow in the fog. And then, slowly, it began to move. It didn't walk or stumble like a person might. It seemed to glide, effortlessly, through the mist, inching closer to the edge of the clearing. My mind screamed for me to do something, anything, but I was frozen with fear, unable to tear my eyes away from the thing that was steadily closing the distance between us. In a panic, I grabbed the embers of my fire and flung them into the fog, desperate to scare it off, but the figure didn't stop. It just kept coming, the whispers growing louder, echoing through the trees, surrounding me. I turned and ran. I don't remember packing up my gear. I don't remember the exact moment I decided to bolt. But the next thing I knew, I was sprinting through the fog, tripping over roots and underbrush, my heart slamming in my chest. The whispering followed me, growing fainter but still there, lingering in the back of my mind. I didn't stop running until I reached my car at the trailhead, breathless and trembling. The fog had followed me the whole way back, clinging to the trees like something alive, watching, waiting. I haven't gone back since. I don't plan to. Whatever I saw that night in Black Hollow Ridge, it wasn't human. And it wasn't just watching me. It was calling me, waiting for me to come closer. And I know deep down that if I had listened, if I had taken just one more step toward that figure, I never would have made it out of those woods alive. Camping had always been my escape. No crowds, no constant buzzing of notifications, just me in the vast wilderness. This time I wanted a more remote location, someplace uncharted, untouched by the typical tourist crowd. So, when I stumbled upon a little-known trail called Moonlit Ridge, deep in the heart of the Appalachian Mountains, I knew I had to check it out. The description said it was secluded, with a breathtaking view of the valley below. It sounded perfect. I packed my gear, eager for the solitude, and set out early in the morning. After hours of driving through winding roads, I finally reached the trailhead. No one else was around. The air was crisp, the smell of pine sharp in my nostrils. This was exactly what I needed. The hike to the top was steep, but rewarding. By the time I reached the ridge, the sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. I quickly set up my tent in a small clearing surrounded by towering trees and a thick canopy that stretched across the sky. In the distance, I could just make out the outline of the valley below, veiled by mist. It was perfect. I made a small fire, cooked a simple meal, and watched the flames dance as night closed in. The stars emerged one by one, twinkling faintly between the leaves, and the forest around me came alive with the sounds of crickets and distant hoots of owls. It was peaceful, a kind of quiet you can't find anywhere else. But as the fire began to burn lower, the atmosphere changed. The air, which had been cool and refreshing, turned cold, unnaturally cold. I zipped up my jacket and pulled my sleeping bag closer to the fire. It was strange for late summer, but I told myself it was just the altitude. Then I heard it, a faint rustling in the trees off to my right. It wasn't the wind. This was something else, something deliberate. I turned my head, straining to listen, but the sound stopped. I told myself it was an animal, a deer, maybe. Nothing to worry about. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. I glanced around the campsite, but nothing seemed out of place. Just shadows, stretching longer and darker as the fire dimmed. I added a few more logs, watching the flames rise, but the feeling persisted. My skin prickled with unease. I tried to focus on the sounds of the forest, the steady chirping of crickets, the distant rustle of leaves. But beneath it there was something else. Something faint, like a whisper carried by the wind. I told myself I was imagining things. Isolation could do that. But then I heard it again, a soft crackling, like footsteps over dry leaves. This time, it was closer. I grabbed my flashlight and stood up, sweeping the beam across the trees. The light flickered and sputtered for a second but held steady. The woods were dense, full of dark shapes and shadows, but I saw nothing unusual. The rustling had stopped again, leaving only the crackle of the fire and the pounding of my heart. "Hello?" I called out, though my voice felt small and weak in the vastness of the forest. No answer, just silence. I sat back down, my muscles tense, the unease now a gnawing feeling in my gut. I told myself I was being paranoid, but my mind kept circling back to those footsteps. They were too deliberate, too slow, like someone or something was circling me, watching. I kept the flashlight in my lap, my eyes darting to every little sound. For a long while nothing happened, just the fire, the forest, and the unsettling cold that clung to the air. My eyelids grew heavy, and I considered heading into the tent for the night, but a soft noise stopped me. It wasn't a rustle this time, it was breathing, low, steady breathing. I froze, my ears straining. It was coming from the trees just beyond the firelight. The beam of my flashlight trembled as I raised it again, shining it into the woods. I couldn't see anything at first, but the sound persisted. I swept the light across the trees, searching for any sign of movement. Then I saw it. A figure, barely visible, standing among the trees. It was just a shadow at first, indistinct. But as I stared, my blood ran cold. It was tall, impossibly tall, with limbs that seemed to stretch unnaturally long. It stood just on the edge of the light, watching. My breath caught in my throat, and for a moment I couldn't move. I just stared at it, my mind struggling to make sense of what I was seeing. It didn't move, didn't make a sound. Just stood there, looming in the darkness, its eyes glinting faintly in the light. I scrambled to my feet, my heart pounding in my chest. I backed toward the fire, keeping the flashlight trained on the figure. My mind raced with thoughts. Was it human? An animal? But deep down, I knew it was neither. The figure didn't move, but I could feel its gaze, cold and piercing. I wanted to run, but my legs felt like lead. I could barely think, barely breathe. The only sound was the crackling of the fire and that steady, deliberate breathing. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the figure vanished. One moment it was there, the next it was gone, swallowed by the shadows. I stood frozen, my flashlight shaking in my hand, waiting for it to reappear. But the woods were silent again, eerily silent. The crickets had stopped, the wind had died. Everything was still. I didn't sleep that night. I sat by the fire, keeping it blazing as high as I could, my eyes darting to every shadow, every flicker of movement. But the figure didn't return. Not that I could see anyway. When dawn finally broke, I packed up my gear in record time. I didn't care about breakfast or enjoying the view anymore. I just wanted to get out of there. The forest seemed different in the light, less menacing, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching me, hidden just out of sight. The hike down the ridge was faster than the climb up, but every few minutes I found myself looking over my shoulder. I never saw the figure again, but the feeling never left. That deep, unsettling sense of being followed. I made it back to my car and drove home, trying to convince myself that it was just my imagination, that maybe I'd been overtired or spooked by the isolation. But even now, weeks later, I can't get it out of my head. Sometimes late at night I hear it again, that soft, deliberate breathing just outside my window. It was supposed to be a simple camping trip. My buddies, Josh and Kyle, had planned this for weeks. We wanted something remote, away from the usual campsites where people parked their shiny new RVs, plugged in, and called it camping. Nah, we wanted the real deal. Off the beaten path, deep woods. We found a spot online, an old, unmarked trail out near the mountains, a place where few people ever went anymore. The photos looked incredible. Thick, towering trees, a crystal-clear river, and nothing but miles of untouched forest. Exactly what we wanted. The hike was brutal. The trailhead was barely visible, just a gap between the trees that you'd miss if you weren't looking for it. We spent hours trekking deeper into the wilderness, the sound of civilization fading with each step. By the time we reached the clearing where we'd set up camp, the sun was already dipping low, casting the woods in a soft, amber light. It was perfect, quiet, isolated. Too quiet, maybe. But we didn't care. We were excited to finally be away from everything, surrounded by nature. Kyle started setting up the tent while Josh and I gathered wood for a fire. We had a routine, and everything was going smoothly, until I noticed something strange. The trees around us were old, massive, gnarled things with roots as thick as my legs. But scattered throughout the clearing, there were dozens of small makeshift crosses. Not like grave markers, more like shrines. Twigs tied together with pieces of fraying string stuck into the ground haphazardly. Some of them were almost hidden in the underbrush, others more prominent, almost deliberately placed. "Hey, you guys see this?" I called over, holding up one of the little crosses. Josh glanced over and shrugged. "Yeah, man, it's just old wood. Probably some Boy Scout troop or something." Kyle laughed. "Yeah, or some hippie art project." I wasn't convinced. There was something odd about them. The way they were arranged didn't feel random. And as I looked closer, I realized some of them had been there a long time, weathered, almost ancient. But a few looked fresh. "Let it go, man," Josh said, slapping me on the back. "We're here to relax, not play detective." I let it go. For a while. The fire was blazing, the tent was up, and after a few beers we all started to loosen up, laughing and telling stupid stories. For a moment, the unease I felt earlier melted away. We were just 3 guys out in the wilderness, having a good time. That is until the sun dipped fully below the horizon and the forest swallowed the light. It's funny how quickly a place can change. As soon as the darkness settled in, the woods around us felt different. It wasn't just quiet anymore. It was dead. The kind of silence that presses down on you, like the whole forest was holding its breath. Kyle noticed it first. "Yo, is it just me or is it weird quiet out here?" Josh chuckled nervously. "Yeah, man, that's the point. We wanted isolation, right?" But we were all feeling it, the tension in the air, the unnatural stillness. There were no sounds of animals, no rustling of leaves, not even the usual chirp of crickets. Just the crackle of our fire and the low hum of the wind. Then in the distance we heard it, a faint click-click. We all froze. The sound was soft, almost too quiet to hear, but it was there. Repetitive. Rhythmic. "Did you guys hear that?" I whispered. Kyle nodded slowly. "Yeah. What the hell is that?" We listened, straining to hear it over the fire. The sound continued, coming from the forest just beyond the clearing. Click-click. Like the sound of something tapping together. Stones? Metal? Josh stood up, grabbing a flashlight. "I'm going to check it out." "Don't," I said, standing up with him. "It's probably nothing, but stay here. Together." Josh gave me a look, but he stayed put. We all stood there, flashlights scanning the edge of the clearing, waiting for the sound to come again. But now there was nothing, just the oppressive silence pressing down on us once more. "I don't like this," Kyle muttered, sitting back down by the fire. "Maybe we should just pack up. Head back in the morning." I nodded, the unease growing in my chest, but Josh was already laughing it off. "Come on, man, it's just the woods. We're probably psyching ourselves out." I wanted to believe him, I really did, but something didn't feel right. We sat in tense silence for a while, listening to the crackling of the fire. The unease hung in the air like smoke. And then, just as I was starting to think maybe Josh was right, we heard it again. Click, click, closer this time. I stood up, gripping the flashlight tighter. What the hell is that? Josh's smile faltered. Okay, yeah, that's weird. We all stood there, flashlights shining into the trees. Nothing. Just the same thick wall of darkness. The same stillness. Click, click. It was louder now, coming from the left, deep in the forest. It didn't sound like an animal. It sounded deliberate. We should go, Kyle said, his voice barely above a whisper. Now. Josh nodded, his bravado finally cracking. We all started packing up in a hurry, the fire dying down to embers. But before we could even get our gear together, the sound changed. It wasn't clicking anymore. It was footsteps. Heavy, deliberate, crunching over the fallen leaves. And it was getting closer. Run, I whispered. Run now. We grabbed what we could and bolted, leaving the tent, the fire, everything behind. We didn't stop running until we were halfway back down the trail, hearts pounding, lungs burning. Finally, we stopped, gasping for breath. We thought we'd escaped, but then as we stood there in the darkness catching our breath, we heard it. Click, click. It wasn't behind us, it wasn't in the woods. It was coming from the trail ahead. We froze, staring into the darkness. Slowly the beam of my flashlight swept forward, cutting through the trees. And that's when I saw them. A figure stood in the middle of the trail, half hidden by shadows. Their face was obscured by a hood, but in their hands, they held 2 stones, tapping them together, rhythmically. Click, click. Behind them, more figures emerged from the darkness. Dozens of them, all standing still watching. We turned and ran back into the woods, the sound of clicking stones following us the whole way. We never found our campsite again. There's something about being alone in the woods that's both liberating and terrifying. I've always found comfort in nature, in the quiet isolation away from the chaos of daily life. So when my friend Luke bailed on our annual camping trip at the last minute, I decided to go alone. I figured a few days out there by myself would be good for me. Just me, my thoughts, and the deep silence of the forest. The drive took me deep into the wilderness, far from cell reception or any sign of civilization. I found the perfect spot, secluded, miles from the nearest hiking trail, surrounded by tall pines that swayed lazily in the late summer breeze. It felt like I had the entire forest to myself, which was exactly what I wanted. By the time I set up camp, the sun was already beginning to dip behind the trees, casting long shadows across the ground. I built a fire and sat for a while, listening to the crackling of the flames and the distant calls of birds. The temperature dropped quickly as dusk settled in, and soon the forest was bathed in darkness, the only light coming from the dim glow of my fire. That's when I heard it, a sound faint at first, like something moving in the underbrush. I tensed, listening closely, but it stopped as soon as it started. Probably an animal, I thought. Deer, maybe, or a raccoon. I shrugged it off and stoked the fire, telling myself not to let my imagination run wild. But the sound came again, louder this time, closer. It wasn't the rustling of leaves or the snapping of twigs. It was heavier, deliberate, like footsteps. My breath caught in my throat, and I found myself staring out into the dark forest, seeing nothing but the flickering shadows cast by the fire. I stood up slowly, peering into the tree line. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding small and unsure in the vast emptiness. No answer, just the soft crackling of the fire and the eerie silence that followed. I forced a laugh, trying to calm my nerves. Maybe it was just an animal passing through. I'd heard deer at night before, and they could sound pretty human-like if you weren't expecting it. Still, I couldn't shake the unease that crept up my spine. I added more wood to the fire and settled back into my chair, determined to ignore the sounds. But it wasn't long before I heard them again, this time, unmistakable footsteps. They circled my camp, moving slowly, deliberately, just outside the reach of the firelight. My heart raced as I grabbed the flashlight and flicked it on, pointing it into the trees. The beam cut through the darkness, but there was nothing. Just the tall, looming pines and the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. I scanned the area for what felt like minutes, but no movement, no glowing eyes reflected back at me. I sat back down, but my heart wouldn't slow. The footsteps, though faint, persisted, always just beyond the light. I couldn't see what was making them, but I could feel its presence, watching, waiting. That's when I realized something strange. The forest, which had been full of the sounds of crickets and nocturnal life just an hour ago, was now completely silent. No wind, no rustling leaves, nothing. Just the fire and those steady circling footsteps. I stood again, my flashlight trembling in my hand as I scanned the tree line. "Who's there?" I yelled, trying to sound more confident than I felt. Still no answer. I could hear my own breathing, fast and shallow, filling the oppressive silence. Then I saw it. A shadow, no, a figure, emerged from the darkness between the trees, just on the edge of my camp. It didn't move, didn't make a sound, just stood there, barely visible in the flickering firelight. It was tall, unnaturally tall, its outline blurry and indistinct. My stomach dropped as I aimed the flashlight at it, but as soon as the beam touched the figure, it vanished. My pulse thundered in my ears as I whipped the light around, searching for it. Nothing. I scanned the entire perimeter, my hands shaking uncontrollably, but there was no sign of the figure. It was as if it had never been there at all, and I wanted to leave. Every instinct screamed at me to pack up and get out of there, but something held me back. Some deep primal part of my brain told me that whatever was out there wouldn't let me go that easily. I sat down, eyes wide, staring into the dark. The footsteps returned, closer now. I could hear them clearly, heavy, deliberate, crunching through the dead leaves and undergrowth just beyond the fire. My flashlight flicked across the trees, desperate to catch any glimpse of movement, but all I could see were the shadows cast by the firelight, twisting and shifting as if alive. Then the fire flickered, just for a moment, but long enough to make my heart stop. The flames dimmed as though something had passed between me and the light, and in that brief instant, I saw it again. The figure. Closer this time, its outline sharper, clearer. It wasn't a man, it was something else. Its limbs were too long, its posture unnatural, and its eyes, God, its eyes, glowed faintly in the dark, reflecting the dying fire like two pale orbs, watching me. I stumbled backward, my flashlight slipping from my grip. I scrambled for it in the dirt, my fingers trembling uncontrollably. By the time I managed to grab it, the figure was gone again. But I knew it was still there. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. I sat by the fire, flashlight in hand, watching, waiting, listening to the endless footsteps that circled my camp until dawn. As soon as the first light of morning broke through the trees, I packed up and left. I didn't bother to eat or take anything but my essentials. I just needed to get out of there, away from whatever had been stalking me through the night. But as I walked back down the trail, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The forest was too quiet, too still. Every now and then I'd hear a rustle behind me, or catch a glimpse of movement in the corner of my eye. And then halfway to my car I saw it again, standing in the distance just beyond the trees, watching. It didn't follow me, but I could feel it. Even now, days later, sitting here in the safety of my home, I can still feel it, watching, waiting. Sometimes late at night, when the world is quiet and still, I swear I hear footsteps outside my window. Slow, deliberate, circling. And I know it's still out there, somewhere. I've always been drawn to the solitude of camping. The idea of escaping the city's noise and immersing myself in nature's embrace has a certain allure. So, when my friend Mark suggested a weekend camping trip to a remote spot he knew, I was all in. Little did I know, this trip would etch itself into my memory for all the wrong reasons. We set out early on a Friday, driving for hours until the roads turned into dirt paths, and the dirt paths into barely visible trails. Our destination was a secluded clearing nestled between towering pines, miles away from any semblance of civilization. As we arrived, the sun was just beginning to dip below the horizon, casting a golden glow over the landscape. It was picturesque, the kind of place that makes you forget about the world. After setting up our tents and gathering firewood, we settled in for the evening. The fire crackled, casting dancing shadows around us. We chatted about work, life, and the beauty of the outdoors. As the night deepened, a hush fell over the forest. The only sounds were the occasional rustling of leaves and the distant hoot of an owl. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful. As I lay in my tent, drifting between wakefulness and sleep, I became aware of a faint sound. At first I thought it was the wind, but it was too rhythmic, too deliberate. It sounded like chanting, soft, echoing chants that seemed to emanate from the trees themselves. I strained to listen, my heart rate quickening. The chants grew louder, more distinct, yet I couldn't make out any words. It was as if the forest was alive with whispered secrets. I glanced over at Mark's tent, but there was no movement. He must be asleep, I thought. I didn't want to disturb him, so I tried to ignore the sounds and get some rest. But sleep eluded me. The chanting continued, ebbing and flowing like a ghostly tide. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were not alone. The next morning, over a breakfast of scrambled eggs and coffee, I mentioned the sounds I had heard. Mark shrugged it off, attributing it to the natural sounds of the forest. Probably just the wind or some nocturnal animals, he said. I wasn't convinced, but I didn't press the issue. Maybe I was overreacting, I told myself. We spent the day hiking and exploring the surrounding area. The forest was dense, with towering trees and a thick underbrush that seemed to swallow sound. As the day wore on, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every rustle in the bushes, every snap of a twig sent a jolt of anxiety through me. Mark, on the other hand, seemed completely at ease, enjoying the tranquility of the woods. That evening, as we sat around the campfire, the atmosphere felt different. The air was heavier, the silence more profound. We talked less, each of us lost in our own thoughts. As the night grew darker, the chanting began again. This time it was louder, more insistent. I could feel the vibrations of the sound in my chest, a low humming chant that seemed to resonate with the very earth beneath us. I looked at Mark, expecting him to acknowledge the noise, but he remained silent, staring into the fire. "Mark," I whispered, "do you hear that?" He didn't respond. "Mark," I said a bit louder this time. Still no response. I reached out to touch his shoulder, and that's when I noticed it. His eyes were closed, his breathing shallow. He was asleep. How could he sleep through this, I wondered. The chanting was so loud now, so pervasive it was impossible to ignore. I stood up, my flashlight in hand, and scanned the perimeter of our campsite. The light penetrated the darkness, illuminating the dense foliage. But I saw nothing out of the ordinary. No figures lurking in the shadows, no signs of life, just the trees standing tall and silent. As I turned to head back to the fire, something caught my eye, a glint of light, like a reflection, deep within the woods. I paused, squinting to get a better look. The reflection grew brighter, moving slowly toward me. My heart raced as I realized it was a pair of eyes glowing in the dark. I froze, my mind racing with possibilities. Was it a wild animal, a person, something else entirely? The eyes continued to approach, and I could hear the faint sound of footsteps, barely audible over the chanting. "Mark," I called out, my voice trembling. No response. The eyes were closer now, and I could make out a shadowy figure behind them. It was tall, with a slender build, and it moved with a grace that seemed unnatural. I backed up slowly, my flashlight trained on the figure, but it continued to advance. "Who are you?" I demanded, trying to keep my voice steady. The figure stopped, its eyes still fixed on me. For a moment there was silence, and then it spoke. Its voice was soft, almost a whisper, but I could hear it clearly. "We are the echoing silence," it said. "We have been waiting for you." I felt a chill run down my spine. "What do you want?" "To show you the truth," the figure replied, "to reveal what lies beneath." Before I could react, the figure raised its hand and I felt a sudden pressure in my head. The chanting grew louder, filling my mind, drowning out all other thoughts. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. The world around me began to fade, and the last thing I saw was the figure standing over me, its eyes glowing with an otherworldly light. I don't know how long I was unconscious. When I woke, I was lying on the ground, the morning sun filtering through the trees. Mark was nowhere to be seen. I called out for him, but there was no response. I searched the campsite, the surrounding woods, but he was gone. It was as if he had vanished without a trace. I packed up our gear and hiked back to the car, my mind numb with confusion and fear. I drove to the nearest town and reported Mark's disappearance to the authorities. They organized a search party, but no one could find any sign of him. It was as if he had been swallowed by the forest. To this day, I don't know what happened that night. I don't know who or what the echoing silence is. All I know is that I will never forget those eyes, that voice, and the feeling of being utterly alone in the woods. I always thought camping alone would be peaceful. Just me, the trees, and the sounds of nature surrounding me, giving me a break from the chaos of the world. I'd done it plenty of times before, but this time was different. It was supposed to be a weekend of solitude, a chance to clear my mind. Instead, it became the most terrifying experience of my life. I drove out early, the sun barely rising, eager to reach a spot deep in the wilderness that I'd discovered months ago. It was perfect. Far off the beaten trail, nestled beside a small stream, with thick trees creating a natural barrier around the clearing. No cell service, no people, just silence. The hike to the spot was longer than I remembered, the forest denser, more suffocating. But I didn't mind. I welcomed the isolation. By the time I reached the clearing, the sun was already low in the sky, casting an eerie orange glow over everything. I quickly set up my tent, started a small fire, and sat back to enjoy the quiet. But as the sun dipped below the horizon and the sky turned dark, something felt off. It wasn't immediate. It crept in slowly, like a pressure building in my chest. The forest around me seemed too quiet, like the usual night sounds. The chirping of insects, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush were muted. I could still hear the stream trickling nearby, but even that sounded distant, like it was further away than it should have been. I shrugged it off, telling myself I was just adjusting to being alone out here. I had a cup of coffee, stared at the fire, and tried to relax. But the feeling only got worse. There was something wrong with the air, like it was heavy, thick, making it hard to breathe. Then the noises started. At first it was a soft rustling, almost too quiet to notice. Just the wind, I thought, brushing through the trees. But the sound was steady, deliberate, and it seemed to circle my camp, staying just outside the reach of the firelight. I stood up, my eyes scanning the darkness beyond the flickering flames. "Hello?" I called out, feeling a little stupid for speaking to the empty woods. But no one answered. The rustling stopped. I waited, listening, my heart beating faster than I wanted to admit. For a moment, everything was still again. I sat back down, poking at the fire, trying to shake the creeping unease. Maybe it was just an animal, a deer or a raccoon, something curious but harmless. I didn't feel any better. A few hours passed and the fire had burned down to glowing embers. The woods were pitch black now, the moon hidden behind thick clouds. I decided to call it a night and climbed into my tent, zipping it up tight. I didn't know why I felt the need to lock myself in, but something told me to. I lay there in the darkness, listening. That's when I heard it again. The rustling, louder this time, closer. It wasn't circling the camp anymore. It was right outside the tent. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat feeling like a hammer. I stayed perfectly still, straining to hear. The rustling stopped directly beside me, and I could hear something breathing. deep, slow breaths, almost like it was smelling the tent, smelling me. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to control the panic rising in my throat. It's just an animal. It'll go away. But the breathing didn't stop. It stayed there, for what felt like hours, just outside the thin layer of nylon separating me from whatever was out there. And then it spoke. Not words, not exactly, but a low, garbled sound, like something trying to mimic speech. The noise twisted and warbled, like a voice broken into pieces, repeating something I couldn't understand. It sent chills down my spine. I was frozen, paralyzed by fear. My mind raced through every possibility. Was it a person? But no human made sounds like that. Was it some kind of animal? But animals don't try to talk. They don't breathe like that. And then, without warning, the tent collapsed inward as if someone, was pressing down on it, hard. I could see the fabric bowing under the weight, and I swear I saw a hand, pale and long, pressing against the top of the tent, slowly dragging its fingers across the surface. I snapped. I grabbed my flashlight, fumbled with the zipper, and burst out of the tent, shining the beam into the night. Nothing. The clearing was empty, the fire long dead, the trees standing silently like they had been all night. But the air was wrong. The oppressive heaviness was still there, and I could feel it watching me, even if I couldn't see it. I stood there for what felt like hours, flashlight shaking in my hand, heart pounding in my ears. Slowly, I backed away from the tent, my every instinct screaming at me to run. But my legs wouldn't listen. I kept turning, shining the light into the trees, expecting to see something, anything, lurking just beyond the reach of the beam. And then I saw it. A figure, pale, thin, unnaturally tall, standing between the trees at the edge of the clearing. It didn't move. It didn't make a sound. But it watched me. I could feel its eyes on me, even though I couldn't see them. I bolted. I didn't pack up. I didn't even try. I just grabbed my keys and ran. The hike back to the car was a blur, my flashlight bouncing wildly as I stumbled through the dark. The whole time, I could hear it behind me, that same rustling, that same breathing following me, always just out of sight but never far enough away. I don't know how long I ran, but I eventually reached my car, threw myself inside, and sped out of there without looking back. I haven't gone camping since. I barely sleep at night anymore. Every time I close my eyes, I hear that breathing, feel that presence just outside my room, watching, waiting. And every now and then, when I'm lying in bed, too terrified to sleep, I hear that garbled, broken voice trying to speak again. But I'll never understand what it's trying to say. Camping had always been a way for me to reset, to escape the stress and noise of everyday life. This time I needed it more than ever. Work had been suffocating, and the idea of disconnecting in the wilderness was too tempting to pass up. I decided to head out to an old campsite deep in the woods, one I hadn't visited in years. It was a place my friends and I used to go when we were younger, back when life seemed simpler. I packed my gear and set out early, eager to get away from it all. The drive was long and winding, taking me deep into the backcountry where the roads turned to dirt, and the cell signal dropped off completely. Perfect. As I reached the old trailhead, a strange sense of nostalgia washed over me. The entrance was a little more overgrown than I remembered. The wooden sign marking the trail faded and weathered by years of neglect. It didn't bother me, though. In fact, the isolation was exactly what I wanted. The hike in was peaceful, with nothing but the sound of birds and the crunch of leaves beneath my boots. I followed the familiar path, though it seemed less worn now, as if fewer people had passed this way in recent years. It didn't surprise me. Most people wanted more modern campsites with all the amenities. But I wasn't most people. I preferred the solitude, the feeling of being miles away from anyone or anything. After a few hours, I reached the clearing where we used to camp. The place hadn't changed much. Same towering pines, the same view of the mountains in the distance. I set up my tent, made a fire, and settled in for a quiet night. The sun began to dip behind the trees, casting long shadows across the clearing. I sat by the fire, watching the flames flicker and listening to the forest come alive with the sounds of night. The air cooled quickly, and I pulled my jacket tighter around me, feeling the cold seep in. That's when I noticed it, a path leading off into the trees that I didn't remember. It was narrow, barely noticeable unless you were looking for it, overgrown with ferns and brush. I frowned, trying to recall if it had always been there. I didn't think so. We had explored every inch of this place back in the day, and I was sure I would have noticed something like that. Curiosity got the better of me. I grabbed my flashlight and stood up, staring down the trail. It snaked into the forest, disappearing into the dark. I hesitated for a moment, wondering if I should really go wandering off alone, but then shrugged it off. I had plenty of daylight left, and besides, I'd hiked this area countless times before. What harm could a short walk do? The path was strange. As I walked, I noticed how quiet the forest became. The usual night sounds, the chirping of crickets, the rustling of leaves, seemed to fade away the deeper I went. The trees grew denser, their branches weaving together overhead, blocking out the fading light. I shone my flashlight around, but the beam only seemed to highlight the encroaching darkness. There was something unsettling about the place, like the air was too still, too cold. But I kept walking, drawn deeper by some strange compulsion, as if the path itself was pulling me forward. Then I saw it. A small cabin barely visible through the trees. Its wooden walls were dark with age, the roof sagging and covered in moss. There were no windows that I could see, just a single weathered door hanging slightly ajar. I stopped in my tracks, my heart beating faster. There was no way this had been here before. We had camped near this spot for years, and I'd never seen any signs of a cabin, let alone something this eerie. It looked ancient, like it had been forgotten by time, hidden away from the world. Against my better judgment, I took a step closer. My flashlight flickered as I approached the cabin, the light dimming as if the batteries were dying. I shook it, but the beam remained weak. The door creaked as it swayed slightly in the breeze, the sound low and mournful. I stepped up to the door and peered inside. Darkness. My flashlight barely penetrated the interior, but what little I could see made my skin crawl. The inside of the cabin was barren, just an empty room with a dirt floor and wooden walls blackened with age. But there was something else. A faint scratching sound like nails dragging across wood came from somewhere deep within the cabin. I took a step back, every instinct screaming at me to leave. But before I could turn away, the door creaked open a little more, as if inviting me in. And that's when I saw it. A hand, pale and withered, slipping out from the shadows. It gripped the edge of the doorframe, its fingers long and gnarled, the nails yellow and cracked. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The hand didn't move, just held on to the door as if waiting for me to step closer. I couldn't move, couldn't tear my eyes away from it. Then, slowly, the hand pulled back into the darkness, disappearing into the cabin's interior. The scratching sound grew louder, more frantic. I didn't wait to see what would come next. I turned and bolted down the path, my flashlight bouncing wildly in my hand. The trees seemed to close in around me, the air thick with an unnatural cold that burned my lungs as I ran. The path, once narrow but clear, now felt suffocating, as if the forest itself was trying to trap me. I didn't stop until I reached my campsite, breathless and drenched in sweat. The fire had died down to embers, casting weak shadows across the clearing. My heart raced as I glanced back at the dark woods, half expecting to see something, someone, emerging from the trees. But there was nothing. I didn't sleep that night. I sat by the fire, keeping it alive, my eyes darting toward the trees, listening for any sign of movement. The scratching sound echoed in my mind, as if it had followed me back from that cursed cabin. At first light, I packed up and left, practically running down the trail toward my car. As I drove away, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, expecting to see that cabin, or something worse, following me. When I got home, I tried to look up information about Moonlit Ridge, the trail, the area, anything that could explain what I'd seen. but there was nothing. No mention of a cabin, no mention of that path. It was as if it didn't exist, but I know what I saw, and sometimes late at night I can still hear it. The faint scratching like nails on wood just outside my window. Waiting. It was supposed to be a weekend away from everything. The noise of the city, the endless emails, the suffocating pressure of daily life. I had always loved the idea of camping, of being out in the wild, surrounded by nothing but the towering trees and the open sky. It was freeing. Or at least it used to be. I'd never camped alone before. But when my friend Dave canceled last minute, something in me snapped. I'd been looking forward to this trip for weeks, and I wasn't about to let his flakiness ruin it. So I packed up my gear, loaded up the car, and drove deep into the mountains. I wasn't about to let fear or isolation get in my way. The road narrowed as I climbed higher into the forest, the trees crowding closer on either side. By the time I reached the trailhead, the sun was already starting to sink behind the jagged peaks, casting long shadows across the forest floor. I grabbed my backpack, took a deep breath of the cool mountain air, and headed into the woods. The first few hours were peaceful, even serene. The distant sound of a stream rushing somewhere to my left, the whisper of the wind through the pine needles. It felt like I had stepped into a different world, a better world. But as night began to fall, that sense of peace started to wane. The forest became darker, the towering trees like black sentinels looming over me. The birds stopped singing. I could hear every twig snap under my boots. Every breath I took seemed too loud. Still, I pressed on, eager to reach the spot I'd scouted on a hiking trip months ago, a small clearing near a lake. By the time I arrived, it was full dark. The moon, half hidden by clouds, barely lit the ground. My headlamp flickered as I set up camp, casting eerie, jittering shadows across the trees. The forest felt different now, more alive in some strange, unsettling way. Every rustle of the leaves, every creak of the branches seemed amplified, and my pulse quickened without me even realizing it. I tried to tell myself it was just nerves, being out here alone. I'd get the fire going, cook some dinner, and relax. That's what I kept telling myself. But the fire wasn't enough. As I sat there, poking at the flames, I realized just how quiet the woods had become. It wasn't just that the birds had gone silent. There was no wind, no rustle, no movement at all, just the sound of my breathing. And then, something else. It was faint at first, almost imperceptible, a distant crunching sound like something walking through the underbrush. I froze, my hand gripping the fire poker. My eyes scanned the edge of the clearing, but my headlamp beam bounced uselessly off the trees, illuminating nothing but darkness. Probably just a deer, I muttered under my breath, but even saying it out loud didn't convince me. The sound stopped for a moment, then started again, closer this time. Crunch. Crunch. I stood up, shining my light into the woods, but all I saw was the thick wall of black trees. The noise stopped again, but my heart was hammering in my chest. I swallowed hard and forced a laugh. Get it together, man. You're alone out here. There's nothing. Crunch. Right behind me. I spun around, the light from my headlamp sweeping over the trees, the bushes. Nothing. But I swear, I felt it. Something standing there, watching me. The fire crackled behind me, but the heat felt too far away, like it was barely keeping the night at bay. That's when I heard the whisper, a soft, breathy sound almost like a sigh. It came from the trees, low and shivering, just on the edge of hearing. Leave. I froze. My blood ran cold. The word had been so quiet, I almost thought I imagined it. But I hadn't. I knew I hadn't. My instinct was to run, to grab my pack, douse the fire, and bolt back down the trail. But my legs wouldn't move. I felt rooted in place, paralyzed by the unseen presence all around me. And then, the whisper came again, clearer this time, closer. Go before it sees you. I stumbled back toward the fire, my hands shaking as I grabbed for my water bottle to douse the flames. But before I could pour it, the fire flickered and went out. Just like that. I was plunged into darkness, the weak beam from my headlamp barely illuminating more than a few feet in front of me. My breath was coming in shallow, rapid gasps now, my mind racing for an explanation. Any explanation. Then I saw it. At the edge of the clearing, just beyond the reach of my light, something moved. A tall, shadowy figure, barely more than a silhouette against the trees. Its shape was wrong. Too long, too thin, and it swayed, almost like it was trying to blend into the trunks behind it. I backed away slowly, my heart pounding in my ears. My mind screamed at me to run, but my body wouldn't listen. It was like I was in a nightmare, where every movement felt like I was wading through molasses. The figure took a step forward, and in that moment I realized something terrible. It wasn't a person. It was never a person. The shape was too fluid, too dark, like it was made of the shadows themselves. Suddenly the whisper was in my ear again, louder this time, insistent. "You shouldn't have come here." I bolted. I didn't care where I was going. I just needed to get away. I ran through the forest, branches slapping at my face, tripping over roots and rocks. The darkness was suffocating, and every time I glanced back I saw that figure, always the same distance behind me, always moving just beyond the reach of my light. I didn't stop running until I burst out onto the trailhead, gasping for breath. My car was there, just where I'd left it. I scrambled for the keys, fumbling in my pocket, and when I finally got inside and slammed the door shut, I didn't stop to look back. I drove for miles, not daring to stop until I reached the small town at the base of the mountains. It wasn't until I was sitting in the parking lot of some rundown diner, trying to calm my shaking hands, that I saw it. There in the backseat mirror, a shape, hunched and tall, barely visible in the darkness, sitting in the back seat, waiting. I never made it home. I don't know what compelled me to take that solo camping trip. Maybe it was stress, maybe it was the need to prove something to myself. I'd always liked the outdoors, but this time felt different. I wasn't seeking the usual escape or connection with nature. No, this was more like I was running from something, or running toward it. I chose a remote campsite deep in the forest, far from any main trails. One of those places you wouldn't know about unless you'd been there before, or someone had told you in a hushed, almost secretive way. It had a reputation, but not the kind people talked about openly. Some called it Whispering Pines. Others didn't call it anything at all. The drive up was uneventful, though the roads became narrower and more overgrown the closer I got to the site. By the time I arrived, the sun was already beginning to sink behind the trees, casting long, golden shadows across the forest floor. I set up my tent quickly, eager to get a fire going before it got too dark. The first couple of hours were peaceful enough. The woods were dense, the air cool and damp. There was something different about the atmosphere here, though. The silence was thick, almost oppressive. Not the usual peaceful quiet of the forest, but more like a void, like the world had been muted. The birds weren't singing, no rustle of small animals in the brush, just nothing. I tried to ignore it, telling myself that I was just jittery from being alone. I stoked the fire, cooking a simple dinner and watching the flames dance as night fell. The firelight felt like a bubble of warmth and safety, and I was reluctant to leave its glow even for a moment. But then the wind picked up. It wasn't much at first, just a gentle breeze that made the trees sway. Then it started to get stronger, and with it came a sound, a soft, low moaning. I told myself it was the wind, that it was just the trees bending and creaking, but there was something almost human about it, like someone whispering from just out of sight. I tried to shake it off, focusing on the fire, but that uneasy feeling only grew. The temperature seemed to drop unnaturally fast, and soon the air was so cold that I could see my breath hanging in the air. The fire, which had been burning brightly, seemed to dim, as if the darkness was swallowing it whole. Then the footsteps started. They were distant at first, faint, like someone or something was moving just beyond the ring of light from my campfire. I whipped around, shining my flashlight into the trees, but all I could see were thick shadows, the forest stretching endlessly in every direction. No sign of anyone. I told myself it was just animals, maybe deer or raccoons, but the footsteps were too deliberate, too steady, like someone walking slowly, methodically, just out of sight. "Hello?" I called, trying to keep my voice steady. "Is someone out there?" The footsteps stopped. The silence returned, thicker than before, pressing in on me from all sides. I strained to listen, but there was nothing. I sat back down, trying to calm my nerves. I'd heard stories of people getting paranoid in the woods, their minds playing tricks on them. Maybe that's what was happening to me. It had to be, right? The footsteps started again, closer this time. I stood up, heart pounding in my chest, gripping the flashlight tighter. I swept the beam across the trees, looking for any sign of movement, but there was nothing. Just the endless sea of black shadows and towering pines. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw something, a figure standing just at the edge of the light. I swung the flashlight toward it, but it was gone. My pulse quickened as I spun around, scanning the tree line. That's when I noticed something strange about the trees themselves. At first I couldn't quite place it, but then it hit me. The trees had shifted. They weren't in the same place they had been when I set up camp. Some were closer now, leaning in toward the fire as though they were watching me. I swallowed hard, the hair on the back of my neck standing on end. I backed up slowly, feeling the weight of the darkness pressing in, as if the forest itself was alive, shifting, changing. And then I heard the voice. At first it was barely more than a breath, a soft whisper carried on the wind. "Leave." I froze, the word cutting through the silence like a knife. My heart was racing now, and I felt cold sweat trickling down the back of my neck. The voice wasn't loud, but it was close, so close that I could almost feel it against my skin. "Leave." This time it was clearer, more distinct. I whipped the flashlight around, desperately searching for the source, but there was no one there. I grabbed my backpack, barely bothering to stuff my things inside, my mind screaming at me to get out of there. I kicked dirt over the fire, trying to douse the flames, but as I did, I noticed something strange. The ground where I had been sitting all night was covered in symbols, crudely drawn circles and spirals, etched into the dirt like some kind of ancient script. I didn't do that. I hadn't touched the ground. The whispering grew louder, overlapping now, coming from all directions. It wasn't just one voice anymore. It was many, all speaking in that same breathless tone. "Leave. Leave. Leave." I ran. I didn't care where I was going as long as it was away from that campsite. My flashlight bounced wildly in front of me as I stumbled through the trees, branches whipping at my face, the voices still echoing behind me. I could feel something chasing me, though I didn't dare look back. I burst out onto the narrow trail, my lungs burning, my legs shaking. I had no idea how far I had run, but I didn't stop. I couldn't. Not until I reached my car. When I finally did, I fumbled with the keys, my hands trembling so badly I almost dropped them. The whispers had stopped now, but the forest was still watching. I could feel it. As I sped down the dirt road, I glanced in the rearview mirror. That's when I saw it. In the faint reflection just beyond the trees, I caught a glimpse of something moving. A figure, tall and shadowy, standing in the middle of the trail, watching me as I drove away. I didn't stop. I didn't slow down, and I haven't been back since. But sometimes at night, when the wind blows just right, I swear I can still hear it. The whispering, telling me I should have never left, because the forest never forgets. I've always loved camping. There's something peaceful about being alone in the woods, surrounded by nothing but nature. No people, no noise, just the crackling of a fire and the rustle of leaves in the wind. I'd done it countless times, in all sorts of places, but this trip was different. This time I decided to push myself, really test my limits. I found an isolated spot deep in the wilderness, miles from the nearest road. It was perfect, or so I thought. The forest was vast and untouched, its thick canopy shrouding the ground in a permanent twilight. The path I followed was barely a trail, just a faint game trail winding through the trees. By the time I reached a small clearing beside a stream, the sun was already setting, casting long shadows through the trees. The air was crisp, and the mist that clung to the ground gave the woods an otherworldly feel. I set up camp quickly, pitched my tent, and built a small fire. As the flames crackled to life, the mist seemed to retreat, allowing me a brief moment of comfort. I sat by the fire, cooking a simple meal, the quiet surrounding me like a blanket. For a while, it was exactly what I had wanted, a perfect escape from the noise of everyday life. But as the darkness deepened and the fire began to die down, a strange unease settled over me. It started with the silence. The forest, which should have been alive with the sounds of insects and nocturnal animals, was utterly still. Not even the rustle of leaves in the wind broke the quiet. It felt like the world was holding its breath. I tried to shake off the feeling, telling myself it was just the isolation getting to me. But then I heard it. A soft crunch, like a footstep, just beyond the edge of the clearing. I froze, straining to listen. At first I thought it was an animal, a deer maybe, or a raccoon. But the sound didn't continue. It was just one step. Then, nothing. I shone my flashlight toward the trees, but the beam barely penetrated the dense mist that had rolled back in. I couldn't see anything. After a few minutes of waiting, the sound didn't return, and I convinced myself it was just my imagination, or maybe a branch falling from a tree. Still, the uneasy feeling lingered. I banked the fire and crawled into my tent, zipping it up tight. Lying there, cocooned in my sleeping bag, I listened intently to the silence, waiting for any sign of movement. But there was nothing. Just the soft trickle of the stream and the occasional crackle from the dying fire. I must have dozed off, because the next thing I remember is waking up to the sound of something brushing against my tent. My heart pounded in my chest. It wasn't the wind. There hadn't been any wind all night. The sound was soft, like fingers lightly tracing the fabric of the tent. I held my breath, listening as the sound circled around me, slow and deliberate. I fumbled for my flashlight, my hands shaking. When I turned it on, the light illuminated the inside of the tent, casting long shadows that danced across the walls. I waited, frozen, listening to the strange brushing sound, but the moment the light came on, it stopped. I waited a long time, my heart hammering in my chest, but the sound didn't return. Eventually, I convinced myself it had to be a branch, or maybe some animal brushing against the tent. Still, I kept the flashlight clutched tightly in my hand as I lay back down, my nerves on edge. I didn't sleep well after that. The next morning I stepped out of the tent, exhausted but relieved to see the pale light of dawn filtering through the trees. The mist was still thick, clinging to the ground like a living thing. I scanned the clearing, half expecting to see signs of something or someone having been there, but everything looked normal, except for one thing. Around my tent, in the soft earth, were footprints. They weren't animal tracks. They were human, barefoot, and they circled my tent several times before disappearing into the woods. My stomach twisted as I stared at the prints. They weren't mine. I had been inside the tent all night, and they were fresh. I packed up camp in record time, stuffing my gear into my backpack without bothering to eat or rest. Every few minutes, I glanced over my shoulder, expecting to see someone or something watching me from the trees. But the woods were empty, as silent as ever. As I started the long hike back to my car, the feeling of being watched grew stronger. I kept my hand on the knife strapped to my belt, my nerves on edge with every step. The trail, which had seemed so clear on the way in, now felt foreign, the trees unfamiliar, the mist disorienting. Hours passed, and the unease grew into a gnawing dread. The silence was oppressive, and every now and then I would hear the faint sound of footsteps behind me. When I stopped, they stopped. When I quickened my pace, so did they. By the time I reached the spot where I had parked my car, the sun was already beginning to set, casting long, eerie shadows across the dirt road. I fumbled with my keys, my hands shaking, desperate to get inside and leave this place behind. But when I reached the car, I stopped cold. There, pressed into the dirt on the side of the car, were handprints. Dozens of them, smeared across the windows and the doors, as if someone or something had been circling the vehicle, touching it, feeling it. The handprints were small, too small to be an adult's. My heart pounded in my chest as I yanked open the car door, threw my gear inside, and jumped behind the wheel. I started the engine, the sound of the motor breaking the silence, and slammed on the gas, speeding down the narrow dirt road, the forest blurring past me. As I drove, I glanced into the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something standing on the road behind me. But there was nothing, just the mist, swirling in the distance. I didn't stop driving until I was miles away, back in the safety of civilization. But even now, days later, I can't shake the feeling that something followed me out of that forest. Something that's still watching. And I swear sometimes late at night I hear the soft sound of footsteps just outside my window. I had been planning this solo camping trip for months. The idea was simple: head out to the most remote spot I could find, spend a couple of nights under the stars, and disconnect from the world. I found a place on an old, barely maintained trail deep in the mountains, a place almost no one knew about. The reviews I'd found in obscure online forums mentioned its beauty, its isolation, and most intriguingly, how people often felt like they weren't alone out there, despite the utter remoteness. I shrugged that part off, though. People tend to get spooked when they're alone in the wilderness. I craved that feeling, a chance to be totally disconnected, alone with my thoughts. After hours of driving and another 2 hours of hiking, I found the spot. It was beautiful, just like I'd imagined. A small clearing surrounded by dense trees, with a cliff edge not far off that overlooked the valley below. The forest seemed endless, stretching out in every direction, and I was the only person for miles. Perfect. I set up camp, got a fire going, and settled in for the evening. As the sun set, I sat by the fire, enjoying the silence. The only sounds were the crackling of the flames and the occasional breeze rustling the leaves. It was peaceful. Exactly what I needed. Around midnight, as the fire was dying down, I heard it. A voice. Faint. Distant. But unmistakable. Help. I sat up, suddenly alert. It wasn't a scream, not a desperate cry, but a soft, almost pleading voice. I strained my ears, listening, but the woods had gone quiet again, just the fire crackling. I shook my head. My imagination was getting the best of me, but then there it was again. Help me, please. This time the voice was clearer, closer. My blood turned cold. It was a woman's voice, soft but filled with something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I grabbed my flashlight and stood up, sweeping the beam across the trees. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding too loud in the stillness. "Is someone out there?" No answer. I stood there for a minute, flashlight in hand, listening. Nothing. Just the wind now, gently pushing through the branches. Maybe I'd misheard, or maybe the wind was playing tricks on me. I sat back down, telling myself it was nothing, but I couldn't shake the unease that had settled deep in my gut. I was just about to crawl into my tent when I heard it again. "Please, help me." This time it sounded like it was coming from the direction of the cliff, just beyond the trees. My heart pounded, but I couldn't ignore it now. What if someone really was out there, hurt or lost? I grabbed my flashlight again and headed toward the sound. The beam of my light cut through the darkness as I walked toward the cliff, the ground beneath my feet soft with pine needles. The forest felt different now, like it was watching me. The trees seemed to close in around me the further I went. I reached the edge of the cliff and stopped, shining my light out over the valley. The drop was steep, jagged rocks far below. Nothing moved. The forest was utterly still. "Hello?" I called again, my voice shaky. No response. I stood there scanning the area with my light. Nothing. Just the trees, the cliff, and the empty valley below. I was about to turn back when I heard something new. A faint rustling sound behind me. I whipped around, shining the flashlight back toward the trees. At first, I saw nothing, just the dark shapes of the forest. But then, I saw it. A figure, standing just at the edge of the tree line. It was barely visible, like a shadow. Tall, thin, its limbs too long, its posture strange, unnatural. "Hello?" I called out, my voice breaking. "Who's there?" The figure didn't move, it just stood there watching me. My heart was hammering in my chest now. The voice had come from the cliff, but this figure, had been behind me the whole time. I took a step back, my flashlight trembling in my hand. And that's when the figure started to move. Not toward me, no, it moved away, back into the trees, slipping silently into the darkness as if it had never been there at all. I stood there, frozen, unsure of what to do. My instincts screamed at me to get the hell out of there, but something else, a morbid curiosity maybe, held me in place. That's when I heard the voice again. "Help me, please." But this time it wasn't distant. It was right behind me. I spun around, pointing the flashlight toward the cliff. But there was no one there. Just the drop, the endless valley below, and the oppressive, suffocating darkness of the forest. I ran back to my camp, my chest tight, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I stumbled into my tent, zipped it up, and sat there in the dark, clutching the flashlight like it was the only thing keeping me alive. I didn't sleep. I sat there for hours, waiting, listening. But the voice didn't come again, and neither did the figure. When the first light of dawn broke, I packed up as fast as I could. I didn't care about breakfast or taking my time. I just needed to get out of there. The hike back felt like a blur, and the entire time, I felt like I was being watched, like something was following me just beyond the edge of the trail. I didn't see anyone or hear anything strange again, but that didn't stop the feeling of dread that followed me all the way to my truck. I've been back home for a few days now, trying to convince myself that it was all in my head, that I imagined the voice, the figure in the trees. But last night, as I lay in bed, I heard it again. "Help me. Please." And somehow I know it followed me back. The strange thing is, I can't stop thinking about the cliff, about how the voice came from there, about the figure watching me from the trees. And sometimes when I close my eyes, I wonder if it was calling me, or warning me. And now, late at night, when the world is quiet, I feel it. It's waiting. It started as a simple camping trip. My buddy Alex and I had been planning it for months, a weekend away from the chaos of the city, just the two of us, deep in the wilderness. I've always loved the outdoors, the peace of it, the way the world felt raw and ancient out there. This time, though, something felt wrong. I could feel it the moment we crossed into the forest, the kind of stillness that presses against your skin, suffocating. We drove deeper than we ever had before, far off the beaten path, into the heart of an old-growth forest I'd only heard rumors about. No one goes out there anymore, a guy at the local gas station told us as we loaded up on supplies. I laughed it off at the time, but he wasn't joking. I saw it in his eyes. They were empty, hollow, like something had been sucked out of him long ago. The trail we followed had been overtaken by time, roots snaking through it, branches heavy and twisted, like they were reaching for us. As we hiked, the air felt thick, almost tangible, and it was quiet. Too quiet. No birds, no insects. Just our footsteps and the sound of our breathing, loud and out of place. We set up camp near a clearing as the sun dipped behind the trees, casting long shadows that twisted into strange shapes. I felt watched, but when I looked around, nothing. Just the darkening woods, their edges blurred by the dusk. After we got the fire going, Alex started joking around, talking about how we should have brought more beer and how he was going to catch the biggest fish in the creek nearby. I smiled, but my heart wasn't in it. That uneasy feeling had lodged itself deep in my gut, like a splinter I couldn't shake. We sat by the fire, talking and laughing, trying to ignore the creeping darkness around us. Then, from the edge of the clearing, I saw it. A figure, just standing there watching us. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me, but then Alex saw it too. He stopped mid-sentence, his face going pale. "Do you see that?" he whispered. I nodded, unable to speak. The figure didn't move, just stood there, a dark silhouette against the trees. We called out, but there was no response, no movement, just watching. After a few minutes, it turned and melted back into the shadows like it had never been there. Alex tried to laugh it off, but it was strained. "Probably just a hiker," he said, poking at the fire. "Nothing to worry about." But his hands were shaking. I could tell he didn't believe his own words. The rest of the night was a blur. I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt that presence, standing just beyond the firelight, waiting, watching. Around 2 a.m., I woke to the sound of something, scraping, like nails on metal. I sat up, my heart pounding, the hairs on my arms standing on end. The fire had died down, leaving only glowing embers. Alex was still sleeping, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. That's when I heard it again, the scraping closer now, coming from the trees. Slowly, I unzipped the tent and stepped outside. The night was thick with fog, curling between the trees like ghostly fingers. The moon was high, casting pale light over the clearing. My breath felt loud in the silence. I walked toward the sound, every step feeling heavier than the last. My flashlight flickered, and for a second, I thought I saw something move just beyond the reach of its beam. My heart hammered in my chest, but I kept walking, drawn toward that terrible sound. Then I saw it. A figure hunched and twisted, dragging something through the dirt. It was standing at the edge of the clearing, its back to me. My flashlight flickered again, and for a split second, I saw its face. It wasn't human. I stumbled back, tripping over my own feet, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I ran back to the tent, shaking Alex awake. He groaned, annoyed, until he saw my face. I didn't have to say a word. He grabbed his flashlight, and we both stood there, waiting, listening. The scraping had stopped. For a long time, we didn't hear anything but our own breathing, shallow and fast. And then, the sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate, getting closer. We stood frozen, waiting for whatever was out there to reveal itself. But nothing came. The footsteps stopped just outside the tent, and then there was silence. After what felt like an eternity, the first rays of dawn began to pierce the fog, and the oppressive atmosphere seemed to lift just a little. We packed up in silence, neither of us saying a word about what had happened. We just wanted to get out of there. As we hiked back, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being followed. Every now and then I'd catch movement out of the corner of my eye, but when I turned, there was nothing, just the trees, swaying in the wind. It wasn't until we reached the car that I noticed something. My heart skipped a beat as I saw the deep gouges on the side of the door, like something had clawed at it. My breath caught in my throat, and I looked at Alex, but he was already getting in, eager to leave. As we drove away, I kept looking in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see that twisted figure standing at the edge of the forest, watching us leave. But the road stayed empty. I should have felt relieved when we finally made it back to the main road, but that feeling didn't come. That night, when I finally got home, I went to take a shower, trying to wash off the grime and fear of the woods. That's when I noticed it. A small cut, right across my stomach, thin like the edge of a razor. I didn't remember getting it. I ran my fingers over the wound, and as I did, I felt something small, hard, lodged just beneath the skin. With shaking hands, I pulled it out. It was a tooth, and it wasn't mine. It was supposed to be a simple camping trip, just me, the trees, and the crackling of a campfire. I needed the break, Work had been relentless, and I thought a weekend alone in the woods would clear my head. Reconnect with nature, find some peace. The drive took me deep into the mountains, far from the city's noise, far from everything really. I didn't want the usual crowded campgrounds, so I found a spot online, a secluded site off the beaten path, a place where I could really disconnect. No cell service, no other campers, just solitude. It sounded perfect. I arrived just before dusk. The forest was already quiet, almost unnaturally so. It felt like the trees were holding their breath, waiting for nightfall. But I shrugged it off. This is what I came for. I set up my tent, got a fire going, and settled into my chair with a book. The sound of the fire crackling was soothing, a welcome change from the constant hum of the city. But as the night deepened, that peacefulness began to feel wrong. It started small. A faint rustling in the bushes, like something was moving around just beyond the tree line. I figured it was an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon. But the sounds didn't stop. They circled the campsite, slow and deliberate, as if whatever it was watching me. I told myself it was nothing, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. As the fire dimmed, the woods grew darker, the kind of darkness that swallows you whole. I stoked the fire and tried to read, but my eyes kept drifting to the shadows just beyond the light. That's when I heard it. A whisper. At first I thought it was the wind, but it was too distinct, too human. Words I couldn't make out, carried on the breeze. I froze, straining to hear, but the whispering stopped. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I scanned the darkness, but there was nothing, just the firelight flickering against the trees. I decided it was time to turn in. Maybe I was just letting my mind get the better of me. After all, I was out here alone, in unfamiliar territory. My tent felt like a safe haven, a thin barrier between me and whatever was out there. But that feeling didn't last long. In the dead of night, I woke to a sound, a low guttural noise like breathing. It wasn't close, but it wasn't far either. I lay there, holding my breath, listening. The sound grew louder, more defined. Footsteps, heavy, deliberate. Crunching through the underbrush. Something, or someone, was out there. My heart pounded in my chest. I wanted to believe it was just an animal, but deep down I knew it wasn't. I could feel it. Something was wrong. I grabbed my flashlight and unzipped the tent, moving as quietly as I could. My hands were shaking as I stepped out into the cold night air. The fire had long since died, leaving only the faint glow of embers. I swung the beam of my flashlight across the trees, my breath coming out in sharp, panicked gasps. Nothing. But that's when I saw it. At the edge of the clearing, just beyond the reach of my light, stood a figure. Tall and unmoving. It looked like a person, but something was off. Its limbs were too long, its posture too rigid, and its eyes, God, its eyes, glowed in the dark, reflecting the beam of my flashlight like an animal's. But it wasn't an animal. It was watching me. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. My mind screamed at me to do something, but I was frozen, locked in place by those glowing eyes. Then, without warning, it started moving toward me. Not walking, gliding. Its movements were unnatural, jerky, like a puppet on strings. And the whispering returned, louder this time, more insistent. The words were clearer now, but they didn't make sense. They were wrong, twisted, like someone speaking a language that didn't belong in this world. I stumbled backward, tripping over my own feet as I fumbled for the tent zipper. My hands were trembling so badly I could barely grip it. I finally managed to get inside and zipped it up, but I knew it wouldn't help. That thing was out there, just beyond the thin layer of fabric. I could hear it now, moving around the tent, its breath rasping in the darkness. I held my breath, waiting for it to come inside, to tear through the canvas and drag me out. But it never did. The footsteps circled the tent again, slower this time, more deliberate, like it was toying with me. Then, just as suddenly as it had come, the sound stopped. Silence. Deafening, suffocating silence. I didn't sleep. I couldn't. I just sat there clutching my flashlight, waiting for the sun to rise. And when it finally did, I packed up as fast as I could and got the hell out of there. But as I threw my gear into the car, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. There were no tracks, no footprints, nothing to suggest anyone or anything had been there at all. The ground was undisturbed, as if I had imagined the whole thing. But I hadn't. I knew what I saw. I sped out of those woods, my heart pounding, my mind racing. But the further I got from that campsite, the more things didn't add up. I kept thinking about that thing, the whispers, and those eyes. And then it hit me. I wasn't alone when I got there. I had passed a sign just off the trail before I found my spot. It was old, worn down, but I remember what it said now. Campground closed due to unexplained disappearances. This place wasn't on the map by accident, and as I sped down the mountain road, I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw a pair of glowing eyes staring back at me from the trees. I always considered myself an outdoor enthusiast. There was something about the serenity of nature, the isolation of a remote campsite, that brought me peace. This trip was meant to be no different. Just me, a backpack, and miles of untouched wilderness. No phone, no social media, just quiet. The forest I chose this time was one I'd never been to before, far off the beaten path, about a 5-hour drive from the nearest town. It was one of those places you hear about on hiking blogs, where people brag about the remoteness, the complete disconnect from the modern world. That's what I wanted. So, I found a clearing deep within the woods, set up my tent, and made a small fire before the sun dipped below the treetops. The first few hours were peaceful, the rustling leaves in the breeze, the crackle of the fire. But as night fell, things started to feel off. I don't know how else to describe it. The air grew colder, and the forest around me felt like it was watching, waiting. The first strange sound I heard was just after dusk, a soft, low whisper, so faint I thought I imagined it. It seemed to drift from the tree line, carried by the wind. I brushed it off. Maybe it was just the trees, but then it happened again, clearer this time. A voice, faint but unmistakable. I stood up, scanning the woods. There was nothing, just shadows. The fire flickered, casting long, twisting shapes across the clearing, making it harder to see. I called out, a mistake in retrospect, but no one answered. My skin prickled. I felt the weight of being truly alone out here. For a moment I thought about packing up and leaving, but no. It was probably just my imagination, right? The mind plays tricks when it's quiet. Hours passed and the whispering stopped, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I tried to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes I could swear I heard footsteps. Soft, barely there, but unmistakable. They seemed to circle the tent, moving slowly, deliberately. I unzipped the tent, flashlight in hand, and stepped outside. The air was still. Too still. Even the insects had gone quiet. I swept the beam of the flashlight through the trees, but again, saw nothing. No footprints, no broken branches, just silence. Then, just as I was about to head back inside, I saw something. A figure. Far off in the trees, barely visible between the trunks. It was standing perfectly still, just outside the range of my light. I could only make out its shape, tall, thin, human-like, but something was wrong. Its proportions seemed off. The limbs too long, the head tilted at an unnatural angle. I called out again, but the figure didn't move. It just stood there, motionless. I backed away, my heart racing, and ducked into the tent, zipping it up quickly. My breath came in shallow gasps, and I tried to convince myself that what I'd seen wasn't real. But it was. I don't know how long I sat there listening. The footsteps returned, closer this time, circling. Then, something touched the tent, a light brush, like fingers running along the fabric. My heart pounded in my chest, my throat tight with fear. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't. The sound of my own breathing was deafening. And then, the whispering came again, louder this time, just outside the tent. "Come, out." I froze, every muscle in my body locked in terror. I could hear the voice more clearly now. It was unmistakable, like someone standing inches away from me, speaking directly into my ear. But I was alone. I knew I was alone. I must have passed out at some point because the next thing I remember, it was morning. The sun had risen and everything seemed normal again. No signs of anyone or anything around the tent. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't safe even in daylight. I hurriedly packed up my things, eager to leave this place behind. As I started the long hike back to my car, I kept looking over my shoulder, convinced that something was following me. The forest felt different now, darker, even in broad daylight. I could still hear the faintest hint of whispering, carried on the wind just out of earshot. By the time I reached my car, I was drenched in sweat, though the air was cool. I threw my gear into the back seat and slammed the door, relief washing over me as I turned the key in the ignition. That's when I noticed it. In the rearview mirror, standing at the edge of the forest, was the figure. That same unnatural shape, too tall, too still. Watching. I gunned the engine and sped down the dirt road, my eyes darting between the road and the mirror. The figure didn't move, but I could feel it somehow. Still watching. Still whispering. When I got home, I tried to forget about it. I told myself it was just my imagination, a trick of the light, the isolation playing with my mind. But then, last night, I woke up to the sound of whispering again. I was in my own bed, hundreds of miles away from that forest. But the whispering was the same, and this time it came from inside my room. I'll be the first to admit I'm not the outdoorsy type, but when my best friend, Hannah, insisted we take a weekend camping trip to unplug, I went along with it. It was her idea of a birthday gift. A couple of nights in nature, no phones, no distractions. Just the two of us and a place she'd been going to with her family for years, Lake Cedarwood. Hannah swore it was a hidden gem deep in the woods and miles from any town. "It's always been so peaceful," she said on the drive there. "You'll love it." By the time we reached the lake, the sun was dipping below the horizon, casting the water in a soft, golden glow. It was beautiful. I couldn't deny that. The lake was perfectly still, like a sheet of glass, reflecting the dense forest surrounding it. The silence was almost eerie, though. No birds, no wind, not even the usual buzzing of insects. Just stillness. We found a clearing by the lake's edge and set up camp, the only sounds being our movements and the occasional splash of a fish in the water. After a simple dinner by the campfire, we sat quietly, watching the stars blink into view above us. The lake was a dark mirror, perfectly reflecting the night sky. As the fire crackled and the night grew colder, Hannah nudged me. "Want to go for a quick night swim? It'll be fun." I hesitated. The lake looked so unnaturally still, but I didn't want to be a buzzkill, so I agreed. We stripped down to our swimsuits and waded into the water, which was surprisingly warm, like bath water, despite the cool night air. The surface barely rippled as we swam out a little way from shore, the quiet of the lake wrapping around us like a thick blanket. We floated on our backs for a while, staring up at the stars, laughing softly about old memories. It was nice, peaceful, until I noticed something off. I glanced over at Hannah, and that's when I saw it. In the water beside her, there was another figure, a reflection, just like ours. But it wasn't hers, and it wasn't mine. It was someone else. I shot up, treading water as my heart raced. The reflection floated just beside Hannah, rippling faintly, but staying there, like it belonged in the water. I couldn't make out a face, just the dark outline of a person standing on the surface of the water, staring down at us. "Hannah," I whispered, my voice trembling. She looked over at me, confused. "What?" I pointed to the water, trying to speak, but the words caught in my throat. Her eyes followed my hand, and for a moment she didn't react. Then, slowly, her face paled. The reflection was still there, hovering beside her in the water. It didn't move. It just stared. Without another word, we both swam frantically back to shore, scrambling out of the water, gasping for breath. When we turned back to the lake, there was nothing. The reflection, the figure, it was gone. The water was still again, as if nothing had happened. "What the hell was that?" I asked, my voice shaking. Hannah didn't answer. She just stared at the lake, her eyes wide with fear. We didn't talk much after that. We just dried off and retreated to the tent, locking ourselves inside. I lay awake for hours, listening to the silence, waiting for some sound, some explanation. But the night stayed quiet. The next morning we woke up early, both eager to leave. As we packed up the campsite, I couldn't stop glancing at the lake. The water was calm, glistening under the morning sun, completely normal. It almost felt like we had imagined the whole thing. As we were about to leave, I walked to the edge of the water one last time. The lake was so still, so clear, that I could see my reflection perfectly. And that's when I noticed something again. There, standing beside my reflection, was another figure. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. It was the same figure from the night before, dark, indistinct, standing beside me in the water. But this time, as I stared, it slowly raised its hand and waved. I backed away, stumbling over the rocks as Hannah came over. "What's wrong?" she asked, seeing the panic on my face. I didn't say anything. I just pointed at the lake, but when she looked, the figure was gone. The water was empty, still reflecting nothing but the trees and sky. There was no sign of the dark figure. It was as if it had never been there, but I knew what I'd seen. We both had. We left Lake Cedarwood in silence, neither of us willing to talk about it. I haven't been camping since, and I never plan to go back. But sometimes when I pass a pond or catch a glimpse of myself in a puddle after a rainstorm, I swear I see it. That figure standing just beside my reflection, just watching and waiting. I've camped alone plenty of times before, but this trip was supposed to be special. I was heading to a place I'd heard about from a coworker, a hidden gem deep in the Adirondacks. She told me it was one of those spots you don't find on any map, just a clearing by a small crystal-clear lake surrounded by thick untouched forest, perfect for getting away from everything. The hike in was brutal. The path was barely a path at all, just a vague line through the woods. It was easy to lose your way if you weren't paying attention, and it didn't help that the further I went, the more overgrown everything seemed. By the time I reached the clearing, the sun was already sinking low, casting long shadows across the trees. But the lake, it was just as beautiful as I'd been told. The water was so still it looked like glass. The sky reflected off it perfectly, and the dense forest around it seemed to press in, as if guarding it from the world. The air was cool and crisp, the kind of air that makes you feel completely alive. I set up camp right by the lake, built a small fire, and sat back to enjoy the solitude. Everything felt perfect, but that nagging feeling that something was just a little off started creeping in almost as soon as the sun disappeared. It was quiet, too quiet. No crickets, no wind rustling the leaves, not even the distant sounds of wildlife. Just silence. The kind of silence that feels like a presence, like the woods themselves are holding their breath, waiting for something. I tried to ignore it. I poked at the fire, ate my dinner, and settled into my tent early. The stillness was unnerving, but I told myself it was just my imagination. I'd been hiking all day, I was exhausted, and I was in an unfamiliar place. That could mess with anyone's head. But then came the scratching. It started slow. At first I thought it was just the trees or the wind, but the more I listened, the more deliberate it sounded. like something was dragging its nails against the bark just outside my tent. Not hard, not fast, just slow, rhythmic scratches. I sat up listening. The sound circled my tent, scraping around me in a perfect, deliberate path. Whatever it was moving, slowly, methodically, like it was taking its time, making sure I knew it was there. I grabbed my flashlight, my hand trembling, and unzipped the tent. I shined the beam out into the darkness, but there was nothing. No animals, no movement, just trees and the reflection of the fire on the still surface of the lake. The scratching stopped. I stood there for a while, listening. The silence had returned, heavy and suffocating. I backed into the tent, zipped it up tight, and sat there, clutching the flashlight, trying to convince myself it was just some animal, maybe a raccoon, maybe a squirrel, but deep down I knew it wasn't. I didn't sleep that night. Morning came slowly. I crawled out of the tent, bleary-eyed and exhausted, and stepped into the clearing. The fire had long since gone out, but the lake was still there, perfectly still, perfectly clear. For a moment I almost convinced myself I'd imagined the whole thing. That's when I noticed the trees. All around the clearing, on every tree within the perimeter of my campsite, were long, deep scratches. Thin, deliberate marks that hadn't been there the night before. They crisscrossed the bark in strange patterns, almost like symbols, though I couldn't make sense of any of it. My stomach turned as I walked around the campsite, looking from tree to tree, the markings growing more intricate the further I went. I decided right then that I wasn't staying another night. I packed up my gear as fast as I could, throwing everything haphazardly into my bag. The weight of the forest was pressing down on me now, as if the trees themselves were watching, waiting for me to leave. But as I turned to start the hike back, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Near the edge of the clearing, right by the tree line, stood a figure. It was barely visible through the dense branches, its form obscured by shadow, but I could see it. Just standing there, watching me. I froze. My heart pounded in my chest as I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound. It was as still as the lake had been the night before. I couldn't make out any details, just a dark silhouette, tall and thin. I called out, but there was no response. The figure just stood there, unmoving, like it was waiting for something. My instincts screamed at me to run, but I couldn't take my eyes off it. Something about it felt wrong. Not human, not animal. Just wrong. Finally, my legs obeyed, and I took a step back, then another. I didn't take my eyes off the figure, but it didn't follow. It just stood there, watching. As soon as I was far enough away, I turned and ran, full speed, down the overgrown trail. The weight of my pack bounced painfully against my back, but I didn't stop. I ran for what felt like hours, pushing through the dense brush, the scratches on the trees flashing in my mind like warnings. I didn't stop until I reached the trailhead and my car, breathless, drenched in sweat. I didn't look back at the woods. I didn't need to. To this day, I can't explain what happened. The figure, the scratches, the eerie stillness of the lake. It all feels like some kind of fever dream. But I know what I saw. I know those scratches were real. And I know that whatever was in those woods that night, it wasn't human. I haven't been camping since. It was supposed to be a simple camping trip, one of those unplug, get back to nature kind of weekends. Me and 3 of my closest friends, Sarah, Kyle, and Jess. We'd been planning it for weeks, hyping ourselves up about escaping the city, breathing fresh mountain air, and spending 2 nights in the woods near a place called Pine Hollow. It wasn't the most popular spot for campers, but that's what drew us in. The isolation. Looking back, I should have known something was off the moment we arrived. Pine Hollow wasn't like any forest I'd seen before. The trees grew thick and dense, their branches twisted in ways that made them look almost alive. But what really hit us was the silence. No birds, no insects. Just the sound of our own footsteps crunching against the dead leaves. Kyle made a joke about it, something like, maybe the animals know something we don't. We all laughed it off, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. We set up camp at the base of a small hill, with just enough clearing to give us a view of the night sky. By the time the sun began to set, we had a fire going and were trading stories, the usual banter you'd expect on a trip like this. But as soon as the last sliver of light disappeared behind the horizon, everything started to feel wrong. It began with little things. First, the fire, which had been roaring moments earlier, suddenly struggled to stay lit. No wind, no rain, just this unnatural choking of the flames. We fed it more wood, but nothing helped. Sarah, who was always the skeptical one, laughed it off, blaming the damp air. But I could see it in her eyes. She was nervous, too. An hour later, Jess started hearing something in the woods behind us. A faint whisper, like a voice carried by the wind, but too low for any of us to make out. We chalked it up to her imagination. "It's the woods," Kyle said. "They play tricks on your mind." But then we all heard it. A low hum, almost melodic, echoing through the trees. We shone our flashlights around, trying to find the source, but the beams were swallowed by the dark, never quite landing on anything. The noise would stop the second we stood up, only to return the moment we settled back down, like it was waiting for us to let our guard down. That's when Jess saw her. Across the clearing, standing just beyond the reach of our firelight, was the figure of a woman. She was pale, almost glowing, her hair long and wild, draped in a torn white dress that fluttered, though there was no breeze. Her face, I couldn't see it clearly, but there was something wrong about the way she moved. Jerky, like she didn't quite belong in her own skin. Jess screamed, and when we all turned to look, she was gone. No footsteps, no sound, just vanished. We tried to laugh it off as stress or exhaustion. I mean, it had been a long day, right? But none of us could shake the feeling that we weren't alone anymore. Kyle suggested we go to bed, convinced it was all in our heads, but I wasn't so sure. My gut told me to stay alert. Sometime in the dead of night, I woke up to the sound of heavy breathing outside my tent. It wasn't human. I could feel the weight of it pressing down on the air, slow and labored, like some huge animal just inches away. I held my breath, praying it would go away. But then came the scratching, a slow, deliberate scraping against the fabric of my tent, like claws teasing the surface. I wanted to scream, but my voice wouldn't come. I could only listen as the sound circled the tent, moving from one side to the next. I knew the others were hearing it too. I could hear Sarah whispering my name from her tent, her voice barely audible. The scratching stopped abruptly, replaced by a low, guttural growl that made my skin crawl. And then, silence. When morning came, I wasn't sure if it had been a dream. But when we crawled out of our tents, we found deep, claw-like marks etched into the dirt around our camp. Not bear tracks, not wolf. Something bigger, something that didn't fit the description of any animal we knew. We packed up in record time, none of us willing to stay a minute longer than we had to. As we hiked back to the car, I noticed something strange. Small piles of stones placed at the base of certain trees. They were spaced evenly, almost ritualistically, throughout the forest. Jess asked if any of us had noticed them on the way in, but none of us had. That's when we met the old man. He was sitting by the trailhead, weathered and hunched, his eyes clouded with age. As we passed, he asked if we had stayed the night in the hollow. We nodded, thinking nothing of it, until he muttered under his breath, "She still walks, doesn't she?" We stopped cold. "Who?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. He looked at me with eyes that seemed to see more than the present. "The bride, the one who was left waiting at the altar. They say she wanders the forest looking for her groom. If you see her, don't let her know. If she thinks you're him." His voice trailed off, leaving us in uneasy silence. We left without another word, but the image of that woman, the way she moved, haunted me for days. But here's the twist, the part that keeps me up at night. A few weeks after the trip, I was scrolling through old photos on my phone and I found one I didn't remember taking. It was from the campsite that night. In the photo, we were sitting around the fire, laughing, not a care in the world. But in the background, just beyond the edge of the light, there was the figure of a woman, her face turned toward us. Not blurry, not shadowy, clear as day. And her eyes, they were fixed on me. I had always been drawn to places off the beaten path, the kind of wilderness where few people dared to go, where the land felt ancient and untouched. So when I heard about Black Hollow, a remote valley hidden deep within a forest preserve, I knew I had to go. There were rumors, of course. Locals in the nearby town wouldn't talk about it. Or if they did, they kept it vague. One old man at the gas station shook his head when I asked for directions, muttering something about bad air and things that don't belong. I laughed it off. I'd heard all kinds of stories about haunted forests and cursed places. It was just folklore, passed down to keep people away. That's what I told myself anyway. The hike into Black Hollow was long and difficult. The trails were barely visible, overgrown and twisted, like the forest was reclaiming the land. The deeper I went, the more I noticed how quiet it was. The usual sounds of the forest, the birds, the wind through the leaves, were absent. It wasn't dead quiet, though. There was a sound, faint at first, just on the edge of hearing. A low, distant hum, almost like wind, but it never changed. It stayed constant, as if it were coming from the earth itself. By the time I reached the valley, the sun was already setting. Black Hollow was beautiful, I had to admit that. The trees were enormous, towering pines with roots that twisted and knotted above the ground. Moss clung to everything, a thick green carpet that muffled my footsteps. And yet, there was something unsettling about it. The air felt heavier, thicker, like I was walking through something more than just fog. I set up camp in a small clearing, the fire casting flickering light across the trees as the last of the daylight faded. I tried to relax, to enjoy the solitude, but the feeling of being watched nagged at me. Every time I looked up from the fire, I found myself glancing into the trees, expecting to see something there. But there was nothing, just shadows. As the night wore on, the hum I had heard earlier grew louder. It wasn't wind. I was sure of that now. It was more like a vibration, a deep thrumming that I could feel in my chest. I tried to ignore it, convincing myself it was just some natural phenomenon I wasn't familiar with. Around midnight, I decided to turn in. I crawled into my tent, zipped up the flap, and settled into my sleeping bag. But sleep didn't come easily. The hum was louder now, vibrating through the ground, through the air, through me. I tossed and turned, trying to get comfortable, trying to convince myself that it was just in my head. And then, just as I was starting to drift off, I heard something else. Footsteps, soft, slow, deliberate. They weren't far off, maybe 20 feet from the tent. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. I told myself it had to be an animal, maybe a deer, curious about the campfire, but the steps were too measured, too human. I grabbed my flashlight and sat up, listening. The footsteps stopped. I waited, straining to hear anything over the low hum that seemed to fill the entire valley. For a long moment, there was nothing, just the persistent vibration. And then the footsteps started again, closer this time. I unzipped the tent just enough to peek out, shining my light toward the trees. The beam cut through the darkness, but I didn't see anything. The fire had burned down to embers, casting a faint glow over the clearing. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding too loud in the eerie quiet. No answer. The footsteps had stopped again, but I could feel something out there, just beyond the light. I stepped out of the tent, sweeping the flashlight around. The forest was still, too still. I moved toward the edge of the clearing, the light bobbing with my shaking hand. And then I saw it. At first, I thought it was just another tree, a shadow among shadows. But as I moved the light across it, the figure took shape. It was tall, impossibly tall, with long, thin limbs that bent at unnatural angles. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, and its head was tilted, like it was listening. I stood there, frozen, unable to comprehend what I was seeing. The figure didn't move, didn't react to the light. It just stood there, its hollow eyes staring right at me. Then, in a slow, jerky motion, it took a step forward. I backed up, nearly tripping over a root, my flashlight shaking wildly in my hand. The figure took another step, its long legs moving awkwardly, like it wasn't used to walking. I wanted to run, to scream, but my body wouldn't respond. I could only watch as it moved closer, its head tilting further, like it was curious about me. And then, as suddenly as it had appeared, it stopped. The hum in the air grew louder, almost deafening now. I could feel it vibrating through my bones, making my teeth chatter. The figure stood there, watching me, unmoving. And then, slowly, it raised one long, thin arm and pointed toward the woods. I didn't need any more encouragement. I turned and bolted back to my tent, grabbing only my backpack and the flashlight. I didn't bother with the rest of my gear. I didn't look back. The hike back to the car was a blur. The hum followed me the entire way, growing fainter as I put more distance between myself and the valley. But even when it faded completely, I could still feel it, a low vibration in the pit of my stomach. By the time I reached my truck, the sun was rising, casting pale light over the mountains. I drove out of there as fast as I could, not stopping until I was miles away. I don't know what I saw in Black Hollow. I don't know if it was real, or if the isolation and the strange energy of the place had gotten to me. But every time I think about going back to the woods, I hear that hum again. And I remember how it felt to be watched, to be pointed toward something I didn't want to see. I won't be camping alone anymore, not ever again. I don't think I'll ever go camping again. I thought it'd be good for us, a way to reset, me, Matt, and Jess, just us three. A little getaway from the city. I'm not much of an outdoors person, but Matt had convinced me. Said the fresh air would do us all some good. Clear our heads, get back to nature, all that stuff. I didn't argue. I needed a break too. The drive to the campsite was uneventful, but something felt off the moment we arrived. It wasn't anything obvious, just a subtle feeling, like the woods were too quiet. No bird song, no wind through the trees. Even Jess, who usually loved stuff like this, made a comment about how the place felt. Empty. Still, we brushed it off. We were miles away from any towns, deep in the wilderness. Maybe that's just what untouched nature feels like. Silent. Alien. We set up camp by the lake, a glassy surface surrounded by towering pines, their needles a deep, unnatural green. The water was so still it felt frozen, like it was holding its breath. Matt made a joke about the place being straight out of a horror movie, and we laughed, but something about his voice seemed forced, nervous. The first night was fine, mostly. We sat around the fire talking and drinking, the crackle of burning wood filling the void of the silent forest. The stars above were bright, almost too bright, like they were watching us. I noticed Jess staring at the tree line a lot, her eyes darting over the shadows as if she was seeing something we couldn't. I didn't say anything. I just figured she was a little spooked. We all were. It wasn't until the second night that things started getting weird. We were sitting by the fire again talking when Matt stopped mid-sentence, his head snapping toward the trees like he'd heard something. "Did you hear that?" he asked, his voice low. I hadn't heard anything, but Jess nodded, her face pale in the firelight. It sounded like whispering. We all went quiet, listening. At first there was nothing, just the same oppressive silence that had been hanging over the place since we arrived. But then, from somewhere deep in the woods, I heard it too. A faint, barely there murmur, like voices carried on the wind. But there was no wind. "It's probably just the trees," I said, trying to sound casual, but my voice trembled. "Wind in the branches or something." Matt stood up, peering into the darkness beyond the fire's glow. "There's no wind." He was right. The air was dead still. For the rest of the night, none of us could relax. The whispers came and went, never close, but always there, just out of reach. Jess kept pacing around, muttering that we should pack up and leave, but Matt insisted we stay, said it was probably just animals. But animals don't whisper. When we finally went to bed, the tent felt like a prison. Every little sound outside had me on edge. The rustling of leaves, the snap of a twig. I barely slept, and when I did, I dreamt of dark shapes moving just beyond the edge of the firelight, watching us. The next morning, Jess was gone. Her tent was empty, her stuff still inside. We searched the woods, calling her name, but there was no trace of her. The only thing we found was her flashlight, lying by the lake. The bulb shattered like she'd dropped it in a hurry. Matt was frantic, saying we needed to go for help, but I could barely think straight. The woods felt wrong. The air was thick, almost suffocating, like the trees were closing in on us. I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone, that something was out there, watching us, waiting. By midday, we still hadn't found Jess, and Matt was losing it. He kept pacing by the water, muttering to himself, his eyes darting to the trees like he was expecting something to come out at any moment. I tried to calm him down, but then I heard it again, the whispers. Only this time they were louder, closer. "We need to go," Matt said, his voice shaking. "We need to get out of here now." We packed up as fast as we could, but by the time we started hiking back to the car, the sun was already setting, casting long, twisted shadows through the trees. The whispers followed us the whole way, growing louder, more frantic, like whatever was making them was right behind us. When we reached the car, it was dark. Matt fumbled with the keys, his hands trembling so badly he dropped them. As he bent to pick them up, I saw something move in the shadows at the edge of the parking lot. "Matt, hurry," I whispered, my heart pounding in my chest. But it was too late. He froze, standing up slowly, his eyes wide as he stared at something over my shoulder. I turned around, and there, standing in the trees, was Jess. But something was wrong. She was too still, too silent. Her face was pale, her eyes wide and unblinking, and then she smiled. Only it wasn't Jess's smile. It was too wide, too unnatural, stretching across her face like someone had carved it there. Before I could react, Matt screamed and bolted toward the car. But the second he reached it, the whispers exploded into a cacophony of voices, all overlapping, all saying the same thing. "Run." I didn't run. I couldn't. My feet were rooted to the spot as I watched Matt scramble into the car, slamming the door shut. The engine roared to life, and he floored it, speeding down the dirt road without looking back. I was alone. Jess, or whatever that thing was, had disappeared into the trees, but the whispers remained, circling around me, growing louder, more insistent. I should have run. I should have tried to escape. But instead, I found myself walking toward the lake, my body moving on its own, the whispers guiding me. As I reached the water's edge, I looked down and saw my reflection, but it wasn't me. The face staring back at me was someone else, something else. Its eyes were hollow, its mouth twisted into that same unnatural smile Jess had worn. And then I realized I hadn't been the one hearing the whispers. I'd been the one making them, all along. Camping had always been my escape. The serenity of the woods, the crackle of a fire, and the stillness of the night. It was my way of hitting pause on life. This trip was no different. I needed to get away, clear my head, and spend a few nights under the stars, far from the stresses of work and the noise of the city. I found a remote spot deep in the mountains, an area so secluded that not even hikers ventured out that far. Perfect. I packed light, just my tent, sleeping bag, a few essentials, and enough food to last a couple of days. No phone, no distractions, just me in the wilderness. The hike to my chosen spot took most of the day. The trail was rugged, but the air was cool, and the views were breathtaking. When I finally reached the clearing, it was just as I had hoped, completely untouched. Surrounded by towering pines with a small stream trickling nearby, the place felt like a hidden paradise. I set up my camp and built a fire as the sun began to set, casting a warm glow over the trees. As night fell, the stars emerged, brighter than I had ever seen them. It was peaceful, perfect. I sat by the fire, watching the flames dance and listening to the quiet hum of the forest. It was everything I had come for. But then, as the fire began to die down and the night grew colder, I heard something faint, just beyond the reach of the firelight. At first, I thought it was an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon scurrying through the underbrush. But the sound wasn't quite right. It wasn't rustling or the snapping of twigs. It was humming. A low, soft hum, like a voice but without any distinct words, drifting through the trees. I tensed, listening carefully, but the sound faded as quickly as it had come. I shook it off, telling myself it was nothing. The woods could be strange at night, especially when you're alone. My imagination was probably getting the better of me. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The firelight flickered and cast long shadows around me, making the trees seem taller, more imposing. I added another log to the fire, hoping it would chase away the creeping sense of unease. But then the humming came again. This time it was closer. A soft, melodic hum, like someone humming a tune just out of earshot. I grabbed my flashlight and stood up, shining the beam into the trees. The light cut through the darkness, but all I saw were the trunks of the pines and the undergrowth. No movement, no glowing eyes reflecting back at me. I stood there, heart pounding, listening. The humming stopped. The only sound was the crackling of the fire and the distant trickle of the stream. I sat back down, trying to calm myself. It was probably just the wind, I told myself, or maybe some distant echo from the valley. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. Hours passed and the fire burned lower. I couldn't relax. Every little sound, the snap of a twig, the rustling of leaves, sent a jolt of fear through me. I kept the flashlight close, my eyes darting to the edge of the clearing, where the darkness pressed in like a living thing. Then, just as I was starting to think I'd imagined it all, I saw something. A figure, barely visible in the shadows, standing just beyond the firelight. It was tall, too tall to be human, and its body seemed to shimmer in the flickering glow of the fire. It stood perfectly still, watching. I blinked, my breath catching in my throat, and the figure was gone. I shone my flashlight where it had been, but there was nothing, just trees and shadows. I told myself I was seeing things. The firelight, the shadows, the isolation, it was all playing tricks on me. But even as I tried to convince myself, I could feel it. Something was out there. I threw more wood on the fire, desperate to keep the light strong. The flames flared up, casting eerie shapes into the night. The temperature dropped even further, and the air felt thick, heavy, like the forest itself was closing in around me. And then I heard it again. Not the humming this time. No, this was different. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps crunching through the underbrush, circling my camp. I stood up, my heart racing, shining the flashlight in every direction. But the beam revealed nothing. The footsteps continued, moving in a slow, steady circle around the clearing, just outside the firelight. I called out, my voice shaking, "Who's there?" No response, just the footsteps, always just out of reach. I backed up toward the fire, the flashlight trembling in my hand. I could feel eyes on me, cold, watching, waiting. The footsteps stopped. The silence that followed was suffocating. The fire crackled softly, and I stood there, frozen, my pulse pounding in my ears. I could feel something out there, lurking just beyond the light, but I couldn't see it. And then from the darkness came the humming again. But this time it was right behind me. I spun around, but there was nothing there, just the fire and the dark woods beyond. My skin crawled as the humming grew louder, echoing all around me, a haunting, wordless tune that sent chills down my spine. I grabbed my bag, heart racing, and made a decision. I needed to get out of there. I didn't care that it was the middle of the night. I didn't care how far I was from my car. I wasn't staying here another second. I stomped out the fire, packed up as quickly as I could, and started down the trail, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The forest was unnaturally quiet now, except for the humming, which seemed to follow me, growing fainter as I hurried down the path. But the feeling of being watched never left. I could feel it. Something was out there, moving in the shadows, keeping pace with me. I walked faster, then broke into a jog, my breath coming in short, panicked bursts. I didn't stop until I reached my car, drenched in sweat and shaking. I threw my gear in the back, jumped into the driver's seat, and sped away without looking back. Even now, back in the safety of my home, I can't shake the feeling that I didn't leave that campsite alone, that whatever was out there, whatever was watching me, followed me back. Sometimes late at night, when everything is still and quiet, I hear it again. The humming, always faint, just outside my window, and I know whatever it is, it's waiting for me to come back. I've never been a superstitious guy. Ghost stories, fun to listen to around a campfire, sure. But believing in them? No way. At least not until last summer. What happened in the woods that weekend? I still have trouble explaining it. And no matter how many times I tell the story, the details don't get any less disturbing. It was late August, and 4 of us, me, Jake, Hannah, and Sarah, decided to go camping one last time before summer ended. We picked this secluded spot deep in the pines, miles from the nearest road, where the trees stretched taller than buildings and the air was thick with the scent of pine needles and damp earth. No cell service, no people. Just us and the forest. That was the whole point. The first day was great. We set up our tents, cracked open a few beers, and laughed around the fire until the stars dotted the sky like glitter. But that night, our first night there, is when the strange stuff started happening. It was around midnight when I first heard it. A rustling sound, faint at first, like something moving through the underbrush near our camp. I chalked it up to an animal. We were in the woods, after all. But then I noticed something odd. The forest had gone completely silent. No crickets, no wind, no usual forest sounds, just nothing. Jake must have noticed it too, because he glanced at me, his face half lit by the fire, and asked, "You hear that?" I nodded but didn't say anything. The others were still chatting, oblivious. Then, another sound, closer this time, a soft crack, like a branch snapping underfoot. I stood up and grabbed my flashlight. Shining it into the trees, all I saw were towering pines and shadows that stretched unnaturally long, twisting in ways that didn't make sense. "Probably a deer or something," Jake said, though I could hear the unease in his voice. He sat back down, but I kept scanning the tree line. I could have sworn I saw something move. A dark shape slipping between the trees, too quick for me to get a good look. I told myself it was nothing and sat back down, trying to shake the weird feeling creeping up my spine. The next morning, we woke up to find that Sarah's backpack was missing. We spent a good hour searching the campsite, thinking maybe she'd just misplaced it, but it was gone. She swore she left it by her tent. "What? Did a raccoon drag it off or something?" Sarah muttered, irritated. But the weird part was that nothing else had been touched. Her food, our gear, everything else was right where we left it. That day, things only got stranger. While we were out hiking, I kept seeing these figures. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, a trick of the light maybe. But every time I glanced back at the trail, there'd be a shadow darting between the trees just out of sight, too human-shaped to be an animal. But when I turned to get a better look, there was nothing there. I didn't mention it to the others. They were already freaked out enough by the backpack incident. That night the noises started again, louder this time. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, circling the campsite. Hannah was the first to speak up. "Does anyone else hear that?" she whispered, clutching her blanket as she peered into the darkness. Before anyone could answer, there was a soft thud. Something heavy, falling just beyond the firelight. Jake jumped to his feet, his face pale. "Okay, that was not a raccoon," he muttered, grabbing the hatchet we'd used to chop firewood. We all stood there, tense, waiting. The footsteps stopped. The forest was silent again. And then from the shadows we saw it, just for a split second. A figure, standing at the edge of the trees. It was tall, impossibly tall, its limbs long and thin, almost skeletal. But the worst part? Its face. It didn't have one. Just a smooth, pale surface where a face should be. It stood there motionless, staring. Or at least I think it was staring. Sarah screamed. I don't blame her. The figure vanished into the woods the moment she did. "Did you guys see that?" she shouted, backing toward the fire. "What the hell was that?" No one had an answer. We huddled together by the fire, trying to make sense of it, but there was no sense to be made. The rest of the night, none of us slept. We just sat there, listening, waiting. At dawn, we decided we'd had enough. We packed up camp as fast as we could, eager to get the hell out of there. But when we went to grab the car keys from Jake's tent, they were gone, just like Sarah's backpack. We tore the campsite apart, looking for them, but they weren't there. And that's when we found the footprints, dozens of them, surrounding our camp. They weren't human. Not exactly. They were too long, too narrow, with claw-like marks dragging through the dirt. And they led off into the forest, disappearing among the pines. "We need to leave, now," Hannah whispered, her voice trembling. But without the keys, we were stuck. The nearest road was miles away. And then we heard it again, the footsteps, slow, deliberate. But this time they weren't circling the camp. They were coming toward us. In a panic, we grabbed what we could and ran. No plan, no direction, just away. The footsteps followed, growing faster, closer. I could feel something behind us, something cold and wrong, like a presence breathing down my neck. We ran for what felt like hours until finally we broke through the tree line, stumbling onto an old logging road. Somehow, by some miracle, there was an old rusty truck parked there. No one questioned it. We just piled in and Jake hotwired it with shaking hands. As we sped away, I looked back at the tree line. There it was again, that figure, standing just beyond the pines, watching us leave. But this time, it wasn't alone. There were more of them, dozens, all tall, faceless, their heads cocked slightly to the side as if curious. We didn't stop driving until we reached the nearest town. We never spoke about it again. Not really. But every now and then, I catch the others glancing over their shoulders, the same way I do. Because deep down, we all know the truth. Whatever those things were, they weren't just watching us. They were waiting. And I have this sinking feeling that they still are. I had always been skeptical of the stories. You know the ones, the local legends that sound just ridiculous enough to be real, but you laugh them off anyway. The kind where someone claims a stretch of woods is haunted, or that something unnatural lives out there, waiting for the next fool to wander too far off the trail. I heard those stories growing up about the Hollow Pines, a dense forest about a 2-hour drive from my hometown. People said if you camped out there, you might hear voices calling to you in the night. No one ever claimed they saw anything, just the voices. I didn't believe it. Why would I? But when my buddies canceled on our annual camping trip at the last minute, I figured it was as good a time as any to check it out. Go to the Hollow Pines, camp for a night, and come back with nothing to show but a few mosquito bites and maybe a good story to make fun of the locals. I told myself I'd spend the weekend fishing, hiking, and enjoying the peace that only comes from being miles away from civilization. The first sign that something wasn't right should have been the weather. The forecast had called for clear skies, but as I neared the forest, clouds rolled in like a heavy, dark curtain. By the time I parked at the trailhead, the air felt charged, like the sky itself was holding its breath. I shrugged it off. Summer storms come and go, nothing unusual. I hiked in about 3 miles and found a nice clearing to set up camp. The woods were quiet, a bit too quiet if I'm being honest. There were no bird calls, no rustling in the bushes. Even the wind seemed muted, the tall pines standing deathly still around me. But again, I didn't think much of it. I just chalked it up to the eerie reputation of the place getting into my head. By the time I set up camp and got a fire going, the clouds had thickened, but no rain had come. The air felt thick and heavy, like something was pressing down on me, but I ignored the creeping unease building in my chest. I was here to relax, not get spooked by some ghost story. As night fell, the silence deepened. The fire crackled softly, casting long shadows over the trees. I sat there listening to the stillness, letting my mind wander. Hours passed like this, my only company the crackling fire and the oppressive weight of the woods around me. Then I heard it. It started faint, almost imperceptible, a soft, distant hum like the wind through the trees, only there was no wind. I strained to listen, thinking it might be the sound of a stream or something else natural. But as it grew closer, I realized it wasn't water. It was a voice. A woman's voice. It was soft at first, barely more than a whisper, drifting through the trees like smoke. I couldn't make out what she was saying, but the tone was unmistakable, calling, beckoning. I stood up, my heart pounding in my chest, and I scanned the darkness. The voice sounded far off, somewhere deep in the trees. It felt like it was coming from everywhere and nowhere all at once. I grabbed my flashlight, sweeping the beam across the tree line, but saw nothing out of the ordinary. No movement, no sign of anyone. "Hello?" I called, feeling a bit ridiculous. "Is someone there?" No answer, just that same soft voice calling again, this time closer. I felt a shiver run down my spine. I wasn't about to let some pranksters mess with me. Maybe some locals had come out here to scare me, knowing the stories of the Hallow Pines. I wasn't falling for it. I stood there for a moment, considering my options. I could stay in the safety of my camp, or I could investigate and prove to myself that there was nothing out there. Of course, I chose the latter. I grabbed my flashlight and headed toward the source of the voice, moving slowly through the trees. The further I walked, the louder it became, but no less strange. The tone was so soft, so sweet, like someone singing just beneath their breath, just out of reach. And then it would stop, leaving nothing but silence behind. After about 10 minutes, I realized something that made my blood run cold. The voice wasn't leading me anywhere. It was circling me. No matter which direction I turned, it always sounded like it was just beyond the trees, just out of sight, but never in one place. I felt my skin prickle as dread settled in my gut. This wasn't right. None of this was right. I turned back, trying to retrace my steps to camp, but something was wrong. The trail had changed. The trees seemed closer now, packed tighter together, their branches reaching out like gnarled hands. Every path I took led me back to the same place, deeper into the woods, further from the clearing where my campfire had been. That's when I saw it. A figure, just beyond the trees, standing in the faint light of my dying flashlight, was a woman. Her back was turned to me, her head bowed, her long hair hanging down in a matted curtain. She stood there, perfectly still, like a statue among the trees. "Hey!" I called, my voice trembling. "Do you need help?" She didn't move. Didn't even acknowledge I had spoken. Just stood there, completely motionless. My gut screamed at me to run, but I found myself rooted to the spot, unable to look away. Then slowly she turned, her face. There was nothing there. No eyes, no mouth, just a blank, pale surface where a face should have been. And yet I swear I could still hear the voice, the soft, beckoning call, coming from her, even though she had no mouth to speak. My legs moved before my mind did. I ran, crashing through the underbrush, my breath ragged and my heart hammering in my chest. I didn't know where I was going, just away from that thing, that impossible, horrible thing. I ran until my legs ached, until I could barely breathe. Eventually, I stumbled out into the clearing where I had set up camp, the embers of my fire still glowing faintly. I collapsed onto the ground, gasping for breath, refusing to look back. I didn't sleep that night. I sat by the fire watching the tree line, waiting for any sign of movement, any hint of that voice returning. But it didn't. As soon as dawn broke, I packed up and left. The entire hike back to the trailhead, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that the woods themselves were holding their breath, waiting for me to slip up and fall back into the trees. I've told this story a few times and no one ever believes me. They laugh it off, say I must have imagined it, that it was just the isolation playing tricks on my mind. But I know what I heard, what I saw. The Hallow Pines are real, and whatever lives in those woods is still there, waiting for the next camper to listen to the call.